The night was heavy with fog, so thick it seemed to swallow the torchlight whole. Shadows flickered across the walls of the courtyard, stretching and twisting as if alive, carrying whispers from centuries past. Every stone seemed to hold a secret, every arch a memory, and yet most passers-by never noticed them. In the quiet of that misty evening, the air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the world were holding its breath for a revelation long delayed. Somewhere in the distant past, a secret had been planted. A secret so dangerous, so profoundly transformative, that the architects of history had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it. It was the kind of secret that reshaped empires, dictated alliances, and whispered to the hearts of men about the fragile boundary between faith, power, and destiny. Legends say that the origin of this secret lies in the Temple of Solomon, the magnificent heart of ancient Jerusalem, where gold gleamed under the sun and sacred wisdom was kept from the eyes of the unworthy. It was here that the first guardians of something extraordinary, the hidden, the sacred, the forbidden, made their solemn vows. No ordinary monks or knights, these men were entrusted with knowledge so potent that it could topple kingdoms or elevate souls beyond earthly comprehension. They were not merely protectors of treasure or scripture. They were custodians of a covenant that predated the knighthood, a covenant whose roots reached deep into the earliest whispers of civilization. As history would later record, centuries after the temple itself had fallen, an order arose in Europe, a brotherhood of warriors who would be celebrated, feared, and vilified in equal measure. The Knights Templar. To the world, they were holy soldiers, defenders of pilgrims, and faithful servants of the Church. But beneath the polished armor and public oaths lay a far more enigmatic truth. The Templars were the inheritors of an ancient design, a lineage of secrecy stretching back to a time when kings and prophets walked in the same shadows, and when knowledge itself was considered both sacred and dangerous. Imagine the first steps of these knights across the stone streets of Jerusalem, their faces obscured by hoods, hearts thrumming with a mixture of devotion and apprehension. The city, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and faiths, was alive with tension, and yet there was something else, something that even the battle-hardened knights could sense, a pulse beneath the chaos. It was as if the stones themselves remembered the presence of those who had once guarded the temple, and in their silence, they beckoned the newcomers to uncover what had been hidden. For the Templars, this was not merely a military campaign. It was initiation into a tradition older than any crown or throne. The Templars' early years were cloaked in austerity and discipline. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, appearing outwardly humble. Their lives were regimented, their meals sparse, their prayers long. Yet behind the closed doors of their chapter houses, beyond the scrutiny of inquisitive eyes, there were teachings and rituals whispered only among the initiated. These rites were rumored to carry the knowledge of Solomon's temple itself, cryptic symbols, coded manuscripts, and ancient ceremonies that seemed to speak directly to the human soul. One could not simply stumble upon this wisdom. It required initiation, loyalty, and an understanding that the pursuit of such knowledge came with immense responsibility and risk. It is said that even the lowliest squire could sense that there was more to the order than met the eye. The air inside the Templar compounds was thick with expectation, charged with the weight of history and mystery alike. Every parchment, every stone, every emblem bore meaning. To the uninitiated, it might have appeared as mere decoration, but to those who understood, it was a map, a guide pointing toward truths hidden from ordinary perception. And yet, for all its subtlety, there was also danger. Knowledge, after all, is rarely harmless. Those who wield it must choose carefully, for it has the power to illuminate the mind or shatter it entirely. Even as the Templars expanded across Europe, taking vows in grand cathedrals and constructing fortresses along pilgrimage routes, the secret they protected remained an invisible current, shaping their decisions in ways outsiders could never comprehend. Each conquest, each architectural marvel, each whispered instruction in candlelit halls was a piece of a puzzle that stretched across centuries. They were scholars and warriors at once, balancing the mundane demands of warfare with the invisible burden of guarding something eternal. It is perhaps this duality, the tension between action and silence, battle and contemplation, that has cemented their place in history as both heroic and enigmatic. Yet the allure of their secret was not only a matter of intellect or devotion. It was deeply human. It promised connection to something larger, something transcendent, and yet tantalizingly out of reach. Imagine the fear and awe that must have coursed through the hearts of those who glimpsed its edge, sensing the magnitude of what they were entrusted to protect. It was a power that could inspire courage beyond measure, but also paranoia, suspicion, and betrayal. History often remembers the battles fought with swords, but the wars of the mind, those fought for knowledge, loyalty, and truth, are just as fierce and often more enduring. The fog outside the gates of the Templar strongholds mirrored the uncertainty of the times. Europe was a continent in flux, kingdoms rising and falling, faiths colliding, and every secret weighed against ambition and greed. In such an environment, secrecy was both shield and sword. To speak too freely of what they knew could invite death, exile, or the erasure of all they had built. And so the Templars became masters of silence, their vows not only spiritual but strategic. To the uninitiated, they were enigmatic knights. To those who sensed their true mission, they were guardians of a lineage that might alter humanity's understanding of history itself. And so, as the night deepened and the fog thickened, one cannot help but feel the pull of that ancient covenant. Even centuries later, the air seems to vibrate with the resonance of promises made and kept, of secrets guarded through fire, betrayal, and time itself. The Templars were more than a military order. They were the living echo of something lost, something powerful, something that still whispers to those willing to listen. And as we embark on this journey into the heart of their mystery, one question lingers, haunting every shadow and every stone. What was so dangerous, so transformative, that history itself sought to erase it forever? In answering this question, we are not merely exploring the past. We are stepping into a narrative where courage, faith, and secrecy intertwine, where the line between legend and reality blurs, and where the faint glimmer of truth might still illuminate the darkness. Every page turned, every legend recalled, every hidden symbol unearthed brings us closer to understanding a brotherhood whose influence stretches far beyond the medieval battlefield. It is a story of human ambition, devotion, and fear. A story that challenges our understanding of what was known, what was hidden, and what was ultimately worth protecting with one's life. Long before the Templars donned their white mantles and red crosses, long before they built their fortresses across Europe or became the wealthiest and most feared order of their age, there was a king whose name echoed through the corridors of time, Solomon. A ruler renowned for his wisdom, his justice, and his devotion. He was said to have built a temple that shimmered with gold, a sanctuary designed to house the divine and the sacred in equal measure. Yet history, as we know it, remembers only the surface, the grandeur, the wealth, the legend. Beneath the polished veneer lies a deeper story, one that whispers of secret oaths, hidden knowledge, and a covenant so profound that it would ripple through centuries, eventually shaping the destiny of men who had never walked his palace halls. Solomon's court was a place of extraordinary contrasts. It was a hub of diplomacy and intrigue, of devotion and temptation, of towering ambition and solemn restraint. Priests whispered their interpretations of sacred texts, scholars debated the nature of truth, and artisans labored to capture the divine in every carving, every gilded surface. But beyond the public eye, beyond the ceremonies and proclamations, there were men who understood that the temple was more than stone and gold. It was a repository of knowledge, a vault of secrets that could illuminate the mysteries of life itself. These men swore themselves to a sacred task, to guard the wisdom of Solomon, to protect the temple from those who would misuse its power, and to pass it forward only to those deemed worthy. What exactly this wisdom contained is impossible to define fully, for the records are fragmented, obscured by centuries of legend and interpretation. Some say it involved hidden methods of interpreting scripture, keys to understanding the patterns of the universe, and perhaps even formulas capable of shaping reality itself. Others insist that it was less about practical knowledge and more about discipline of the soul, the cultivation of moral insight, courage, and discernment. Whatever the truth, it was universally recognized as dangerous in the wrong hands. A man who held this knowledge could be a kingmaker or a destroyer, and the burden of guarding it demanded unwavering loyalty, absolute secrecy, and a courage few could sustain. It was in this crucible of divine purpose and human ambition that the first hints of an order began to emerge, a brotherhood whose origins were entwined with the very stones of the temple. These early guardians were not knights in shining armor, nor monks cloistered in meditation alone. They were something in between, trained in strategy, ritual, and devotion. They were chosen not for wealth or noble birth, but for character, the ability to hold a secret larger than themselves and to act with unwavering integrity in its defense. Every oath taken within the temple's golden walls was a promise to protect not merely physical treasures but a legacy of understanding, a covenant that would survive long after kings and empires had crumbled to dust. Legends suggest that Solomon himself foresaw the threats that would come after his death. The invasions, the looting, the waves of history that might seek to plunder not only his riches but the knowledge contained within the temple's sacred halls. In response, he allegedly established a hierarchy, a system of guardians and disciples who would ensure the continuity of his order. Each generation of guardians trained the next, passing down secret symbols, coded instructions, and rituals designed to reveal truths gradually, to those who were patient, worthy, and morally prepared. These lessons were not merely academic. They were transformative, shaping the character of men who would eventually influence history in ways no one could have foreseen. The significance of this hidden order cannot be overstated. To the casual observer, Solomon's temple was a magnificent edifice of religious devotion. To the initiated, it was a living archive, a matrix of knowledge, and a training ground for individuals who could operate in the shadows of kings and empires alike. It was both a beacon and a shield, and yet, as with all great secrets, its existence carried peril. Any revelation, misinterpretation, or betrayal could unleash consequences that reverberated far beyond Jerusalem, and the guardians understood that the weight of this responsibility might demand the ultimate sacrifice: their lives and the suppression of their own desires and ambitions for the sake of a greater truth. This secret lineage, carefully preserved, would survive even the destruction of the temple itself. Conquerors came and went, empires rose and fell, yet whispers of the covenant endured. Some relics were hidden, some scrolls encoded with ciphers that could only be deciphered by the initiated, some knowledge transmitted orally to trusted successors. It is from this shadowed inheritance that the Templars would eventually emerge, centuries later, in a vastly different world but carrying the same invisible burden. The knights who rode across the Holy Land during the Crusades, defending pilgrims and fighting battles, were more than they appeared. Their outward mission was sacred and martial, but beneath the armor and vows of obedience lay a connection to an ancient order, a thread linking them to a king whose wisdom had shaped a civilization. It is tempting to imagine the first Templars arriving in Jerusalem, gazing upon the remnants of Solomon's temple, and sensing something profound in the air. Perhaps they felt a pull toward a truth that existed beyond scripture or law, a resonance of a covenant whose significance had been obscured by centuries of conquest and chaos. Even as they knelt in prayer, sharpened their swords, or surveyed the city's streets, they were custodians of a legacy older than their own. Every step they took was guided not only by strategy and faith, but by an inherited understanding of the delicate balance between power, morality, and secrecy. And yet, there is also a human dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. For all their discipline and purpose, the guardians of Solomon's legacy were men subject to fear, doubt, and temptation. They experienced longing, loss, and the heavy weight of responsibility. They understood that the world outside the temple's walls could be cruel and unforgiving, and that knowledge, no matter how noble its intent, carried the seeds of corruption. This tension between sacred duty and human vulnerability is perhaps what made the covenant both so potent and so perilous. The same wisdom that could elevate a soul could also destroy it if mishandled. A lesson that would resonate with the Templars and all those who followed in their shadow. The story of Solomon's hidden order is therefore more than history. It is a meditation on the nature of knowledge, secrecy, and human ambition. It reminds us that behind every legend, every fortress, every battle, There lies a deeper current, invisible to most, shaping events and destinies in ways that are only perceptible to the few who walk in its path. The Templars, with their vows, their codes, and their enigmatic legacy, are the heirs of this current. Their history is inseparable from the wisdom and warnings embedded in the stones of the temple, and their rise, influence, and eventual fall are all part of a larger story. A story that begins not in Europe, not on the battlefield, but in the shadowed corridors of Solomon's palace, where kings, priests, and guardians whispered secrets that would endure for millennia. And so, as we trace the footsteps of this ancient order, we are not merely exploring knights and battles. We are entering a world where devotion and power intertwine, where wisdom is both a gift and a burden, and where every decision carries weight far beyond the individual. The legacy of Solomon's order is a reminder that history is often more than the chronicles we read. It is the story of what was hidden, protected, and passed on in silence. To understand the Templars, we must first understand the covenant they inherited, the wisdom they were sworn to guard, and the perilous, extraordinary responsibility that came with that trust. The guardians who had once protected the Temple of Solomon were no ordinary men. They moved in silence, trained in skills both spiritual and practical, carrying the weight of knowledge that could topple kingdoms or uplift civilizations. Their hands built nothing for themselves. Their swords defended not territories but truths that were older than empires. They understood that the physical world, the streets, the markets, the throne rooms, was only a veneer, a distraction from the invisible currents that governed the fate of men. Every decision, every action, was guided by a principle that seemed almost incomprehensible to ordinary observers: the preservation of a covenant whose magnitude exceeded the imagination. These early guardians were bound by oath, but their devotion went beyond loyalty to a king or even to a deity. They were stewards of wisdom, tasked with safeguarding a lineage of insight passed down through generations. The training was rigorous, encompassing meditation, strategy, memorization, and the study of symbols so subtle that their significance could elude even the most intelligent eye. Each symbol, each ritual, was a key to understanding truths that were deliberately hidden from the masses. And yet, with all their discipline, they were also deeply human, capable of doubt, longing, and fear. The very humanity that made them guardians also made their mission perilous. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, could unravel centuries of careful preservation. As empires rose and fell around them, the guardians adapted. When foreign powers invaded Jerusalem, when the temple's walls were breached and gold looted, they acted swiftly to preserve what could not be replaced. Sacred scrolls were hidden, relics concealed, and teachings passed to those deemed worthy. It was not merely a matter of survival but of judgment. Who could be trusted with knowledge powerful enough to alter faith, politics, and culture? These decisions were never easy, and many men paid the ultimate price for failure. Yet through this crucible of uncertainty and danger, the order endured, leaving a trail of whispers, coded messages, and symbols that would echo through history. One of the most extraordinary aspects of these early guardians was their understanding of secrecy. They knew that the value of knowledge was not in its possession but in its concealment and careful transmission. A secret revealed too soon could devastate nations. A truth misused could corrupt entire societies. They therefore developed methods that were sophisticated for their time: hidden chambers, encoded manuscripts, oral traditions, and symbolic architecture designed to conceal meaning in plain sight. To the untrained eye, these were mere details, ornamental flourishes, or curiosities. To the initiated, they were maps, guides, and warnings. Every detail mattered, and every act of protection was a step in a chain that stretched far beyond any individual lifetime. As centuries passed, whispers of this hidden order reached the ears of scholars, travelers, and visionaries across the Mediterranean. Some dismissed these rumors as legend, while others, drawn by the promise of hidden knowledge, sought it relentlessly. Those who stumbled too close without preparation often met with disappointment or danger, for the guardians had honed not only physical and intellectual skills but the ability to test the hearts of those who approached. They recognized that knowledge without discipline was a weapon capable of immense harm. In this way, the order became both a filter and a forge, screening the unworthy while shaping those who were capable of carrying the burden of wisdom. It was this careful cultivation that, centuries later, laid the groundwork for the emergence of the Templars. The knights, who would become legendary for their courage on the battlefield, were not merely warriors in the traditional sense. They inherited a spiritual and intellectual lineage that traced back to Solomon's original guardians. Their public mission, protecting pilgrims, defending holy sites, and engaging in crusades, was only part of their purpose. Beneath the surface lay a deeper task: the continuation of a tradition that intertwined faith, knowledge, and moral responsibility in ways that would define their order and set them apart from any other knights of Europe. The transmission of this secret knowledge was rarely straightforward. It required mentorship, testing, and initiation. Candidates were observed not only for skill and intelligence but for character and restraint. Many were turned away or guided elsewhere, for the guardians understood that the misuse of wisdom could be catastrophic. The order was as much about shaping men as it was about protecting relics. Discipline, courage, and insight were forged in tandem, creating a class of men capable of operating in shadows, making difficult moral choices, and safeguarding truths that would remain invisible to the broader world. Even the architecture and symbols of the guardians were deliberate, layered with meaning designed to communicate with the initiated while deceiving outsiders. A stone carved with intricate patterns, a door hidden behind a false wall, or a series of symbols etched in a manuscript could convey guidance, warnings, or encouragement to those who knew how to read them. The ordinary observer would see only artistry. The trained eye would perceive a language of secrecy, one that required intuition as well as intellect. In this way, the guardians turned everyday life into a living archive of wisdom, embedding knowledge in objects, rituals, and landscapes in a manner that would survive centuries of upheaval. The human stakes of this mission were immense. Guardians were expected to live lives of integrity and restraint, often sacrificing personal ambition, comfort, or desire. They understood that the consequences of failure extended far beyond themselves. A misplaced word, a moment of weakness, or a lapse in judgment could jeopardize not only the order but the very knowledge they had sworn to protect. And yet, for all its discipline and danger, there was also a sense of purpose and transcendence that sustained them. They were participants in something larger than themselves, stewards of truths that connected the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of these early guardians is the enduring sense of mystery that surrounds them. They left few direct records, choosing instead to encode their teachings in symbols, stories, and rituals that could survive the ravages of time. Centuries later, the Templars, consciously or unconsciously, would inherit this same approach. Their own codes, rituals, and structures mirrored the principles of their predecessors: concealment, moral rigor, and the careful cultivation of those deemed worthy. It is this invisible lineage that makes the Templar story far more than a tale of knights and crusades. It is a story of continuity, of wisdom preserved through shadow and silence, of human devotion elevated to the level of legacy. When we look at the Templars centuries later, riding across Europe and the Holy Land, constructing fortresses, and engaging in battles of incredible scale, it is easy to focus only on their public deeds. But hidden beneath the armor, beneath the oaths, and beneath the outward rituals, there was a continuity of purpose stretching back to Solomon's temple. Each knight carried not only a sword but the invisible inheritance of a covenant older than himself. Every fortress, every manuscript, every ritual contained traces of the guardians' methods, their discipline, and their unwavering commitment to protect knowledge that could alter the world. And so, the story of the first guardians is not merely a prelude to the Templars. It is their origin story in the deepest sense. It is a story of dedication, secrecy, and courage, of wisdom transmitted in ways both subtle and profound, of men who understood that some truths are too powerful to reveal freely, yet too important to let vanish into the shadows of history. It is a story that reminds us that the past is never truly lost, that every legend contains a kernel of enduring truth, and that the choices of a few can echo across centuries, shaping destinies that no single individual could fully comprehend. In tracing the lineage from Solomon's first guardians to the knights who would later ride under the banner of the Templars, we begin to see the hidden architecture of history. It is not built solely of wars, treaties, or conquests, but of invisible lines of continuity, threads of knowledge, loyalty, and courage that connect distant centuries. Understanding this is essential to understanding the Templars, for without the context of the original guardians, their actions, rituals, and secrecy appear almost random. With this perspective, we can see them not merely as knights, but as participants in a centuries-long covenant, carrying forward a mission that transcended borders, politics, and even mortality itself. Long before the Templars carved their path through history, before their banners fluttered over fortified castles or their wealth became legendary, the guardians of Solomon's legacy had left subtle, nearly invisible traces across the lands they touched. These were not the grand monuments, towering obelisks, or gilded halls meant to impress the untrained eye. They were far more sophisticated than that, symbols and artifacts carefully placed to convey meaning only to those who knew how to see. Maps hidden in manuscripts, coded inscriptions etched into stone, and architectural motifs designed to encode knowledge formed a network that stretched across continents. The guardians understood that the survival of their secret depended not only on the loyalty of those who carried it but also on the clever concealment of its very existence. It is said that these clues were deliberately enigmatic, almost teasing, leaving tantalizing glimpses of something greater without ever revealing it outright. A scholar poring over an ancient scroll might notice a peculiar sequence of letters, a slight irregularity in a map, or a symbol subtly repeated across multiple documents. To the uninitiated, these anomalies would appear as quirks or decorative flourishes. To the trained eye, however, they were breadcrumbs, guiding those deemed worthy along a path that could eventually lead to understanding. And yet, the guardians knew that every clue carried risk. Misinterpretation could be catastrophic, leading the seeker astray, or worse, alerting those who might exploit the knowledge for destructive ends. This intricate system of hidden guidance extended far beyond the confines of Jerusalem. As trade, pilgrimage, and conquest spread across the Mediterranean, artifacts, scrolls, and manuscripts were carried from city to city, each subtly altered to ensure that the knowledge remained protected. The guardians' understanding of geography, culture, and human behavior was profound. They knew which cities were safe havens, which rulers were trustworthy, and which scholars could be counted upon to decode the hidden messages. Every move was calculated, every placement deliberate. This was not chaos. It was a masterful, century-spanning strategy designed to preserve a covenant of wisdom that could easily have been lost to time. Among the most fascinating elements of this hidden system were the maps. These were no ordinary maps depicting roads, rivers, and borders. They contained layers of encoded meaning, references to sacred geometry, and alignments with celestial events. A mountain or river might serve as a marker, a city a cipher. To the untrained, these were simply topographical details, but to those initiated into the guardian's methods, they were coordinates pointing toward relics, manuscripts, or sites of knowledge. Scholars centuries later would describe these as mysterious anomalies, unaware that they were glimpsing the faint outlines of a deliberately concealed network, a guide written in symbols rather than words, in silence rather than speech. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this system was its subtlety. The guardians were acutely aware that knowledge, no matter how sacred, could be both a gift and a curse, revealing too much risk destruction, revealing too little risk stagnation or loss. And so they struck a delicate balance. Hints were scattered widely enough that a determined seeker could, over time and through discernment, piece together the path. But the path was not simple. It required intellect, morality, and patience. Those who sought quick answers, driven by greed or ambition, would fail. The Guardian's design ensured that only those who understood the weight of the knowledge and the responsibility it entailed would succeed. Over the centuries, these hidden markers traveled across the lands of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Monks transcribed manuscripts containing veiled instructions. Scholars copied diagrams whose significance was obscured by deliberate ambiguity, and artisans carved motifs into stonework that only an attentive observer could interpret. Even as empires rose and fell, wars ravaged territories, and religious movements surged and ebbed, the subtle signals endured. It is here, in this quiet, patient persistence, that we begin to see the connection between Solomon's original guardians and the knights who would later be known as Templars. The order's formation in Europe was not merely a response to the Crusades or a need to defend pilgrims. It was the next phase in a chain of stewardship that had already been unfolding for centuries. The idea that the Templars were following more than just faith, more than just military obligation, emerges from this historical thread. They were inheritors of a silent instruction, a roadmap to secrets embedded in symbols, structures, and texts. Even the simplest seeming task, protecting a relic, recording a manuscript, or constructing a fortress, might carry a hidden dimension. The Templars were not only guardians of the faithful, they were stewards of a hidden legacy, a living network of knowledge whose original architects had long vanished. Each fortress and church they built, every codex they transcribed, may have been positioned with this layered purpose in mind, a pattern invisible to the untrained eye but essential to the survival of the secret. Yet, with this inheritance came a profound tension. Knowledge, particularly the kind that could influence kings and empires, inevitably attracts ambition, envy, and suspicion. As the Templars grew in wealth and influence, this tension intensified. Outsiders began to see not just knights or monks but symbols of power, institutions that were both revered and feared. The very secrecy that had preserved the covenant made them vulnerable. They were, in essence, a paradox, immensely powerful and yet perpetually under threat. And perhaps this is why the network of hidden markers was so vital. It ensured that even if the order itself were attacked, the knowledge could survive, dispersed and encoded, waiting for the next generation capable of understanding it. It is also important to consider the human dimension of these hidden maps. They were not merely intellectual exercises. They were a form of guidance through uncertainty, a moral compass in a world dominated by chaos and ambition. Each symbol or hidden instruction carried a lesson: patience, discernment, courage, and humility. The guardians understood that wisdom is inseparable from character, and that knowledge, if divorced from ethical judgment, could become destructive. In this way, the maps were as much about shaping the human mind and spirit as they were about pointing to physical relics or treasures. They were a moral as well as a practical tool, designed to cultivate the qualities necessary for stewardship of something larger than oneself. Even today, centuries later, these hidden markers continue to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and scholars of the mysterious. Ancient manuscripts contain diagrams that seem nonsensical. Stone buildings display proportions and alignments that defy conventional explanation. Maps reveal anomalies that modern cartographers struggle to interpret. Some dismiss these as coincidences or artistic flourishes. Others, however, see them as remnants of a deliberate design, a trail left by those who understood that true knowledge could not be preserved openly. It is this interplay between secrecy, symbolism, and strategy that forms one of the most compelling dimensions of the Templars' history. They were simultaneously warriors, monks, scholars, and custodians of a legacy older than their own lives. And so, as we trace the migration of sacred texts, hidden symbols, and encoded maps, we begin to perceive a pattern, a subtle architecture of history that defies simple explanation. The Templars were not only knights of faith but heirs to a deliberate system of preservation, a network of knowledge that had been carefully tended for centuries. To follow them is to follow the faint outlines of a plan, a continuum that stretches from the golden halls of Solomon's temple to the stone fortresses and manuscripts of medieval Europe. It is a journey that demands patience, discernment, and imagination, for the clues are never blatant. They are whispers in stone, shadows in parchment, traces of a hidden wisdom that challenges our understanding of history itself. Every step along this invisible path invites questions that are as profound as they are unsettling. How much of what we know about the past is shaped by what was hidden? What truths have been preserved only for those capable of seeing beyond the surface? And perhaps most tantalizing of all, what if the Templars were not merely following orders or defending pilgrims, but pursuing a mission conceived millennia earlier, guided by a network of knowledge designed to survive the collapse of empires and the passage of centuries. The air of Jerusalem during the time of the Crusades was heavy with both devotion and tension, as if the very stones of the city carried the weight of centuries of sacred promise and human ambition. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, seeking the grace of holy sites, while soldiers, merchants, and scholars crisscrossed its crowded streets. Among them moved the early knights who would become the Templars, men drawn not only by faith but by an unspoken calling, a sense of purpose that extended beyond simple devotion. For these knights, the Holy Land was not merely a battlefield. It was a testing ground, a place where courage, morality, and wisdom would be tested against the chaotic forces of politics, war, and human desire. Their formation in the early years of the 12th century was officially sanctioned by the Church, yet the order's deeper mission was rooted in something far older. While the knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and pledged to protect pilgrims traveling to sacred sites, their existence was inextricably linked to the invisible lineage of guardians who had preserved Solomon's legacy. Each sword they carried, each fortress they built, each manuscript they transcribed was a link in a chain that stretched across centuries. They were not merely soldiers of Christendom. They were custodians of secrets older than kingdoms, and their actions in the Holy Land were both strategic and symbolic. The early years of the Templars were marked by discipline and austerity. Their lives followed a strict rhythm of prayer, training, and study. The training was rigorous, combining martial skill with intellectual and spiritual cultivation. They were taught not only how to wield weapons but how to interpret symbols, understand hidden meanings in texts, and recognize patterns that others would overlook. It was a delicate balance between action and reflection, between the visible and the invisible, and it shaped them into figures who could operate both in the chaos of battle and the silence of sacred spaces. Their public duties were a cover, a structure that allowed the true purpose of the order to endure: the protection and transmission of knowledge, the preservation of a covenant whose origin lay in the Temple of Solomon. The knights' presence in Jerusalem was both a blessing and a provocation. The city was a hub of political intrigue, a crossroads of cultures, religions, and ambitions. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish factions jostled for influence, and the Templars, while sworn to protect pilgrims, were constantly navigating the treacherous currents of diplomacy and conflict. They built fortresses at key locations, not merely for defense but as points of control, observation, and subtle guardianship of sites deemed sacred or strategically important. Each construction, each patrol, each seemingly routine act carried layers of significance, echoing the careful planning and foresight of the ancient guardians who had preceded them. The human dimension of their work cannot be overstated. These men were thrust into situations where courage alone was insufficient. They witnessed suffering, betrayal, and the fragility of human life on a daily basis. Pilgrims were attacked, cities besieged, and entire communities displaced. In this environment, the Templars' dual purpose, military and custodial, became intertwined with the ethical and spiritual challenges they faced. They were warriors, yes, but they were also philosophers, scholars, and moral arbiters, navigating a world in which faith, power, and knowledge intersected in dangerous and unpredictable ways. It was during these early years that the order began to distinguish itself in ways that would become legendary. They were disciplined to a degree unmatched by most contemporary armies, able to respond to threats with precision and coordination. Their reputation for bravery and effectiveness quickly spread, drawing new recruits who were not only skilled with weapons, but committed to the ideals of the order. Yet even as their numbers grew and their influence expanded, the deeper purpose of their existence remained hidden from outsiders. The Templars were an enigma, knights in service to Christendom, but also inheritors of a sacred covenant whose implications extended far beyond any battlefield. One of the most remarkable aspects of the early Templars was the tension between their outward appearance and their inner mission. To the public, they were devoted, obedient, and formidable. To those initiated into the order's deeper secrets, they were guardians of a knowledge that could alter understanding of faith, politics, and history itself. This duality created both power and vulnerability. It allowed them to operate with authority and discretion, but it also made them targets. Any display of independent thought or insight into their true purpose risked suspicion, intrigue, and eventual confrontation with authorities who did not comprehend, or feared, the Order's invisible mandate. Their military engagements were therefore not only acts of defense but also rituals of preparation, discipline, and moral testing. Every battle honed their skills, but also reinforced the principles they were sworn to uphold. They were trained to observe, to interpret, and to act with foresight. Even in the chaos of war, they maintained a focus on their deeper mission. This combination of martial excellence and intellectual acumen made the Templars unlike any other force of their time. They were warriors of shadow and light, combatants and custodians, bound by oaths that reached far beyond the temporal concerns of any king or pope. As the Order expanded, it began to develop systems that ensured the survival of its mission even amidst turmoil. Fortresses were designed with hidden chambers, secret passages, and strategic vantage points. Manuscripts were copied with intentional ambiguity, embedding layers of meaning visible only to those who had been trained to decode them. Correspondence, travel, and logistics were handled with precision and discretion, creating a network that stretched across kingdoms. It was a system designed not merely for military efficiency but for the preservation of a hidden legacy. Every action reinforced the continuity of a covenant established centuries before, echoing the careful strategies of Solomon's first guardians. Yet, even as the Templars solidified their reputation, they could not escape the currents of politics and suspicion. Their wealth, discipline, and secrecy aroused both admiration and envy. Kings sought their support, enemies feared their influence, and even the Church, their patron and protector, grew wary of their independence. The seeds of conflict were sown not because of overt ambition but because the Order carried with it a power that transcended conventional authority. It was the kind of power that could not be measured in gold or land, and it was precisely this invisible influence that would later provoke one of the most dramatic betrayals in European history. And yet, in those early years, the Templars were still young, focused on survival, training, and the fulfillment of their sacred mission. They moved through Jerusalem and the Holy Land with a sense of purpose that was palpable, a rhythm guided not only by orders from their superiors but by an inherited intuition, a subtle understanding of what must be preserved and protected. Each patrol, each fortress, each manuscript transcribed was part of a continuum, a chain of responsibility that stretched from Solomon's temple through the centuries, connecting men across time through a shared commitment to secrecy, courage, and devotion. In this light, the Crusades were not merely a series of military campaigns but a proving ground. They tested the Templars' discipline, courage, and understanding of the deeper purpose that guided them. The victories and defeats, the alliances and betrayals, the moments of awe and despair, all contributed to the shaping of a brotherhood that would endure long after the battles had ended. It was a training in every sense: martial, spiritual, ethical, and intellectual. And it is in this crucible that the Templars began to earn a reputation that would make their eventual rise, influence, and dramatic downfall all the more remarkable. For they were not merely warriors. They were stewards of a legacy older than Christendom itself, guardians of knowledge and power whose resonance would echo for centuries. The public image of the Templars was one of rigid devotion and martial excellence, a brotherhood bound by vows and sworn to protect pilgrims and holy sites. But beneath the polished exterior, behind the white mantles adorned with red crosses, lay a hidden world that few outsiders ever glimpsed. Within the chapter houses and fortresses, beyond the scrutiny of kings and the watchful eyes of the clergy, the knights engaged in rituals and practices that were far more profound, far more enigmatic, than any ordinary military order. These were not merely ceremonies of faith or protocol. They were exercises in secrecy, discipline, and spiritual insight, designed to awaken understanding and fortify character, and to connect the knights to a lineage that stretched back to Solomon's temple itself. The Templars' secret creed was built upon layers of symbolism, coded language, and carefully structured rituals. Every initiation, every recitation of oath, and every step in their ceremonial process carried multiple meanings. To an uninitiated observer, the ceremonies might have appeared as simple religious observances. But for those within the order, Every action, every gesture, every word was deliberate, a key to understanding deeper truths. It was as if the very act of participation was meant to train the mind, to heighten awareness, and to instill a sense of responsibility that transcended the immediate concerns of battle or earthly reward. Central to the creed was the notion of duality, the visible and the invisible, the temporal and the eternal, the sword and the spirit. The Templars were taught that their outward actions, their defense of pilgrims, their engagement in battle, were only a surface layer. The true work was internal and hidden, a moral and intellectual journey designed to cultivate discernment, courage, and the ability to safeguard knowledge too dangerous to be revealed casually. They were, in effect, apprentices in a sacred craft, learning to navigate a world where appearances were deceiving, and where every action could have consequences far beyond the immediate. The rituals themselves were a blend of inherited tradition and original innovation. Some elements were derived from the practices of earlier custodians of sacred knowledge, echoing the methods of Solomon's original guardians. Other components were adaptations, designed to suit the order's unique mission in a medieval context. The ceremonies emphasized loyalty, secrecy, and moral integrity, often testing the candidate's character in subtle but profound ways. Initiates were observed for their humility, their judgment, and their capacity for restraint. The Templars understood that wisdom untempered by discipline could be destructive, and so the creed was as much about shaping character as it was about imparting knowledge. Symbols were woven throughout the order's practices, in ways that were at once obvious and profoundly hidden. The red cross on the white mantle, for example, represented not only martyrdom and faith but also a continuity of purpose, linking the knights to a lineage that spanned centuries and continents. Architectural elements in chapter houses and fortresses often contain symbolic proportions or alignments, invisible to the casual observer but rich with meaning for the initiated. Even the design of manuscripts and letters could carry hidden codes, conveying messages to those who had the training to interpret them. In essence, the Templars' world was layered, a reality in which surface appearances masked a far more complex network of knowledge and intention. The secrecy surrounding the creed was both protective and transformative. It shielded the knights from outside interference, from those who might misuse or misunderstand their purpose. It also served as a crucible, forcing the initiates to internalize lessons slowly, to observe patterns, and to develop intuition. The process was deliberate, methodical, and often psychologically demanding. Knights were not simply trained in combat or ritual. They were educated in the art of judgment, the subtlety of perception, and the weight of responsibility. Every step in the initiation, every symbol understood, every subtle lesson absorbed was designed to prepare them for the immense responsibility of safeguarding knowledge and relics that could shift the course of history. The creed also emphasized moral courage. Knights were taught to resist temptation, to act in accordance with conscience, and to prioritize the preservation of wisdom over personal gain. These lessons were not theoretical. They were tested continuously. In battle, in negotiation, in the daily life of the order, the Templars were faced with choices that could compromise their mission or reveal secrets prematurely. The discipline instilled by the creed allowed them to navigate these challenges, to act with foresight, and to remain steadfast even under extreme pressure. In this way, the order functioned as both a military and spiritual school, cultivating men capable of extraordinary loyalty, judgment, and moral insight. Perhaps most intriguingly, the secret creed also incorporated elements that have fueled speculation for centuries. References to ancient texts, obscure symbols, and ceremonial actions suggest that the Templars were connected to a broader network of esoteric knowledge. Some scholars argue that these elements were derived from earlier traditions associated with Solomon's Temple, while others suggest influence from mystical schools encountered in the Holy Land. Regardless of origin, the result was an order whose inner workings were as complex as they were disciplined, a brotherhood capable of operating simultaneously in the public and hidden spheres. The secrecy of the creed inevitably generated fear and suspicion among outsiders. Rumors of strange ceremonies, mysterious rites, and hidden knowledge circulated widely. Some accused the order of heresy, believing that the Templars' secret practices were evidence of deviance rather than devotion. In truth, these accusations often reflected the tension between power, knowledge, and misunderstanding. The Templars' secrecy protected not only the knowledge itself but also the integrity of the order and its members. Misinterpretation could have catastrophic consequences, and the Knights were acutely aware of the danger of exposure. Within the order, the creed created a sense of unity and identity that transcended nationality, wealth, or background. Knights from France, England, Portugal, and beyond were bound together by shared understanding, by the rituals and symbols that connected them to a lineage older than any kingdom. This internal cohesion allowed the order to function with extraordinary efficiency, discipline, and purpose. It also reinforced the moral and spiritual lessons embedded in their practices. The creed was a living framework, guiding behavior, shaping decisions, and maintaining the continuity of a sacred mission that spanned centuries. Over time, the secret creed became inseparable from the Templars' identity. It was a lens through which they viewed the world, a structure that allowed them to interpret events, navigate danger, and fulfill their dual mission as warriors and guardians of hidden knowledge. Even as the order expanded, gaining wealth, influence, and notoriety, the creed remained the invisible spine of their power. It was the source of cohesion, the repository of values, and the subtle mechanism that ensured the order's continuity through the turbulence of war, politics, and betrayal. And yet, for all its sophistication, the creed was not immune to the pressures of human ambition and fear. The very secrecy that preserved knowledge also created vulnerability. As the Templars grew in influence, outsiders began to sense that the order possessed something extraordinary, something that extended beyond ordinary military prowess. The mystery surrounding the creed, the coded rituals, and the hidden symbols became both a shield and a magnet for suspicion. It was this tension between revelation and concealment, power and secrecy, that would later contribute to the dramatic fall of the Templars, and yet it also underscores the extraordinary foresight, discipline, and moral fortitude of the order at its height. In essence, the Templars' secret creed was a system of wisdom as much as of ritual. It preserved ancient knowledge, trained men in moral and intellectual discipline, and created a brotherhood capable of enduring centuries of challenge. It connected the Knights not only to their immediate mission, but to a lineage stretching back to the first guardians of Solomon's Temple, linking them to a history of responsibility, courage, and fidelity that defied time. To understand the Templars, therefore, one must look beyond the battles, the castles, and the public image, and enter the inner world shaped by the creed. A world of symbols, rituals, and lessons designed to cultivate extraordinary human beings capable of safeguarding the most potent and dangerous truths known to history. The Templars' rise was as much a story of influence and ingenuity as it was of courage and devotion. As the order expanded across Europe, their reputation extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the courts of kings, the chambers of nobles, and the intricate webs of medieval finance. What began as a brotherhood dedicated to protecting pilgrims gradually transformed into an institution whose power was measured not only in swords but in gold, land, and allegiance. Their wealth was astonishing, accumulated through donations from grateful monarchs, gifts from nobles seeking protection, and the revenues of the estates they managed. Yet, while this affluence might have seemed a natural outcome of their success, it concealed a profound tension. How could men bound by vows of poverty wield such influence without betraying the spiritual principles that defined their order? At the heart of this paradox was the extraordinary discipline of the Templars. Unlike ordinary nobles or wealthy merchants, their accumulation of resources was tightly controlled, managed not for personal enrichment but for the order's continuity and mission. Every estate, every coin, every letter of credit was catalogued with meticulous care. Their network extended across kingdoms, allowing them to provide loans, manage property, and coordinate military campaigns with a level of efficiency unprecedented in medieval Europe. Kings who were often at the mercy of volatile economies and uncertain allegiances found themselves relying on the Templars for stability. They became de facto bankers, trusted advisors, and, in many cases, arbiters of disputes that extended far beyond the battlefield. The juxtaposition of their public vows and their real-world influence created a magnetic aura of both admiration and suspicion. On one hand, They were revered as models of discipline and faith, men who had dedicated their lives to a higher calling. On the other, their reach into finance, land management, and political counsel raised eyebrows, especially among rulers who feared that the order's loyalty might surpass that owed to any single crown. Their wealth allowed them autonomy, a freedom that was both empowering and dangerous. The Templars could act independently, make decisions that shaped cities and regions, and influence the outcomes of wars, all while cloaked in the moral authority of their sacred vows. It was this very combination of spiritual legitimacy and worldly power that made the Templars extraordinary, and yet it was also the source of their vulnerability. Their influence was not invisible. It was tangible, measured in estates, coin, and the loyalty of knights trained to operate with exceptional discipline. They became indispensable to monarchs and clergy alike, yet this indispensability bred envy and fear. In the courts of Europe, whispers began to circulate. Rumors of secret wealth, hidden knowledge, and mysterious practices that set the order apart from ordinary knights. The same secrecy that preserved their sacred mission became a magnet for suspicion, as those outside the order could sense the presence of power they could not comprehend or control. Their financial operations were particularly remarkable. The Templars developed early forms of banking, allowing pilgrims to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them in another, facilitating safe travel across dangerous territories. They extended loans to kings and nobles, provided secure storage for treasures, and managed estates with an efficiency that rivaled modern institutions. Yet, this system was more than a practical innovation. It was a means of sustaining the order's hidden mission. Every coin moved through a network that reinforced their autonomy, ensured resources were available where needed, and supported the ongoing stewardship of sacred relics and knowledge. In essence, wealth became a tool, not an end, enabling the Templars to act according to their secretive and complex mandate. The moral tension inherent in this accumulation of power cannot be overstated. Knights who had sworn poverty were managing immense resources, controlling vast lands, and wielding influence that could rival kings. Yet the order's discipline, ritual, and creed provided a framework to navigate this tension. The wealth was carefully circumscribed, its use strictly aligned with the order's mission. Personal enrichment was forbidden. The accumulation of power was justified only insofar as it served a higher purpose. This delicate balance between principle and pragmatism was a hallmark of the Templars' enduring success, yet it also made them enigmatic to outsiders who could not understand how men bound by vows could exercise such authority. In addition to financial and territorial power, the Templars wielded influence through strategic alliances. They cultivated relationships with kings, nobles, and church leaders, leveraging trust, loyalty, and reputation to protect pilgrims and advance their mission. This influence was subtle, exercised through counsel, negotiation, and presence rather than overt domination. It was a form of power that was simultaneously visible and invisible, like the weight of a shadow, perceptible, yet impossible to grasp fully. Those who tried to confront or manipulate the order often found themselves outmaneuvered, as the Templars' discipline, intelligence, and adherence to their secretive code allowed them to operate on levels beyond conventional politics. Yet the accumulation of wealth and influence was not without consequence. It attracted scrutiny, envy, and fear, particularly from those who could not perceive the spiritual and ethical framework guiding the order. Rumors of secretive rites, hidden knowledge, and mysterious practices began to circulate more widely, setting the stage for confrontation. The very traits that made the Templars effective and revered, their discipline, secrecy, and networked influence, also made them appear dangerous to monarchs and clergy who could not fully control or understand them. It was this combination of respect and suspicion that would later contribute to their dramatic downfall, illustrating the peril inherent in wielding power that is both extraordinary and concealed. The tension between the spiritual and the temporal, between vows and influence, also shaped the internal culture of the order. Knights were constantly reminded of their dual responsibilities: to serve the faithful and to safeguard the hidden knowledge that had been entrusted to them. Discipline, loyalty, and moral integrity were enforced not only through rules but through ritual, symbolism, and observation. The wealth they managed, the lands they controlled, and the power they wielded were never ends in themselves. They were tools to fulfill a mission that transcended personal ambition and temporal concerns. This internal balancing act required extraordinary character and vigilance, ensuring that the order remained focused on its deeper purpose even as it accumulated unprecedented worldly resources. It is within this context that the Templars' rise to prominence must be understood. Their wealth, influence, and reach were not accidental. They were carefully cultivated, disciplined, and maintained in service of a mission that extended far beyond the battlefield. Each fortress, estate, and manuscript was part of a larger strategy to preserve knowledge, protect sacred relics, and ensure the Order's autonomy in a turbulent and often hostile world. In this sense, the Templars were not simply knights or monks. They were stewards of a legacy that required not only martial skill but strategic acumen, financial management, and moral rigor. The juxtaposition of vows and worldly power created an aura of mystery that continues to captivate historians, scholars, and enthusiasts centuries later. Observers could sense that the Templars were extraordinary, yet the true nature of their mission remained hidden, encoded in their rituals, networks, and disciplined operations. It was a carefully orchestrated balance, a tension that allowed them to act with unprecedented effectiveness while preserving the secrecy of their higher purpose. Their ability to navigate this paradox, maintaining moral integrity while wielding immense influence, set them apart not only from other military orders but from virtually any institution in medieval Europe. Ultimately, the Templars' wealth and influence were inseparable from their mission, inseparable from their creed, and inseparable from the hidden lineage they had inherited. They were men operating in the shadow of history, carrying forward a covenant that demanded both extraordinary discipline and extraordinary insight. Their success, their reputation, and their eventual vulnerability were all intertwined with the paradox of power. The need to wield it without being consumed by it, to influence without revealing, and to safeguard knowledge whose consequences were far greater than any battlefield victory could measure. It was this delicate balance that defined the Order and left a legacy that continues to intrigue, inspire, and mystify even today. The world that the Templars entered in the East was unlike anything they had known in Europe. Jerusalem and its surrounding regions were not merely the physical heart of the Holy Land. They were a crossroads of culture, knowledge, and spirituality, a place where languages, philosophies, and religious traditions collided and intertwined in ways both subtle and profound. It was here, amid bustling markets, narrow stone streets, and sacred precincts, that the knights came into contact with scholars, mystics, and philosophers whose wisdom had been cultivated over centuries, often hidden from the eyes of the wider world. To the Templars, these encounters were more than diplomatic or intellectual curiosities. They were gateways to knowledge that could redefine their understanding of faith, power, and the mysteries they were sworn to protect. The East was a repository of learning, a place where civilizations had preserved and expanded upon the wisdom of previous generations. Manuscripts written in languages both familiar and strange lined the libraries of scholars, detailing astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. Mystics practiced disciplines that explored the nature of consciousness, the soul, and the divine, offering insights that were often coded in symbolism, allegory, and ritual. For the Templars, trained to perceive layers of meaning in the hidden symbols of their own tradition, these encounters were both illuminating and disorienting. The wisdom they encountered seemed at once alien and familiar, a reflection of the principles that had guided Solomon's guardians, yet expressed through a different lens, shaped by centuries of Eastern thought. Some scholars and mystics were deliberately cautious, aware that outsiders often sought knowledge for ambition rather than understanding. Others were more open, recognizing the Templars' discipline, moral rigor, and potential for stewardship. Through these selective interactions, the knights absorbed fragments of insight, principles of geometry and proportion, methods of encoding and encrypting information, philosophies of moral and spiritual alignment, that would later influence their practices in Europe. These teachings were rarely formalized. They came in conversation, observation, and subtle guidance, often accompanied by parables or symbolic demonstrations that required interpretation. It was a form of education that demanded patience, discernment, and humility, qualities that the Templars' own training had already begun to cultivate. The cultural and intellectual richness of the East also offered practical advantages. Mathematical methods learned from scholars improved fortification designs, strategic calculations, and logistical planning. Observations of the stars and celestial alignments informed both navigation and the timing of military operations. Philosophical concepts offered frameworks for understanding justice, leadership, and ethics in a world dominated by war and politics. In essence, the East became both a laboratory and a library, a place where the Templars could refine the combination of martial skill, spiritual discipline, and intellectual acuity that defined their order. Yet it was not merely knowledge of techniques or science that they encountered. It was the realization that wisdom could exist in forms and places entirely outside the familiar European tradition. Mystics spoke of hidden truths embedded in symbols, of knowledge transmitted orally or through allegory, accessible only to those with insight, patience, and moral discipline. They hinted at connections between the material and spiritual realms, the visible and the invisible, and the delicate balance required to wield insight without corruption. These principles resonated deeply with the Templars, echoing the hidden covenant that had guided Solomon's original guardians and the rituals embedded within the order's secret creed. In a sense, the East offered both validation and expansion of what the Knights already understood, that the preservation of sacred knowledge required both discipline and discretion, courage and discernment. Interactions with Eastern scholars were not always straightforward. Language, custom, and cultural assumptions created barriers, and misinterpretation could be perilous. A casual remark might conceal a layered truth. A gesture might carry symbolic significance. The Templars, trained to observe details and interpret meaning, quickly learned to read not only words but context, subtle cues, and the unspoken communication that often accompanied instruction. This ability to perceive beyond surface appearances became invaluable, sharpening their skills in discernment and reinforcing the importance of secrecy and careful observation in the preservation of knowledge. In some instances, these exchanges provided tangible benefits to the Templars' mission. Manuscripts containing mathematical or geometric insights were copied and encoded, later influencing the design of fortresses, chapter houses, and symbolic architecture in Europe. Philosophical concepts informed approaches to leadership, governance, and moral decision-making within the order. And in rare cases, knowledge of rituals, symbolism, and hidden traditions offered guidance for the secret practices that connected the Knights to the ancient covenant of Solomon's guardians. These were not merely practical lessons. They were keys to understanding a world in which knowledge, power, and faith were inseparable. The human dimension of these interactions was equally profound. The Knights came to recognize that wisdom could not be separated from character. The scholars and mystics they encountered often emphasized ethical discipline, humility, and the careful use of insight, warning that knowledge without restraint could be as dangerous as ignorance. These lessons reinforced the Templars' own internal training, reminding them that their mission was not simply to fight or to acquire power, but to act as custodians of a delicate legacy. Each conversation, each observation, each carefully interpreted symbol became part of an intricate tapestry that connected martial practice, spiritual discipline, and intellectual responsibility. The influence of the East on the Templars was subtle yet enduring. Even as they returned to Europe, their experiences shaped the order's rituals, architecture, and approach to secrecy. Symbols and methods absorbed abroad were integrated into their existing framework, creating a synthesis of knowledge that was both profound and intentionally obscure. European observers might see only fortified castles, disciplined knights, and disciplined rituals. To the initiated, however, these structures and practices contained echoes of distant lands, hints of wisdom acquired through careful observation, dialogue, and disciplined interpretation. It was a legacy that could survive time, conquest, and the eventual persecution of the order itself. Yet this deeper understanding also reinforced the dangers inherent in their mission. The knowledge they carried, refined, expanded, and preserved, was extraordinary precisely because it was rare, powerful, and potentially transformative. Those outside the order could never fully comprehend its scope, and those who attempted to exploit it recklessly could unleash consequences beyond imagination. The Templars' exposure to Eastern wisdom thus deepened their sense of responsibility, heightening both their reverence for secrecy and their understanding of the moral imperative underpinning their work. Knowledge, they realized, was not merely a tool, it was a living responsibility, one that could shape the destinies of individuals, nations, and empires. In the end, the Templars' encounters in the East were transformative on multiple levels. They provided practical techniques, philosophical frameworks, and symbolic understanding that enriched the order's internal practices. They validated and expanded the principles embedded in the secret creed, reinforcing the continuity of a lineage that traced back to Solomon's guardians. And they instilled a profound awareness of the moral and ethical weight of knowledge, reminding the Knights that their mission was as much about restraint and discernment as it was about courage and action. As the Knights returned to Europe, these experiences remained deeply imprinted on their consciousness. The fortresses they built, the manuscripts they copied, and the rituals they conducted were imbued with lessons learned far from their homelands. The Order's expansion, its influence, and its eventual legendary reputation were all shaped, in part, by these encounters with Eastern scholars, mystics, and hidden wisdom. It was a world where knowledge could be concealed in symbols, transmitted in silence, and preserved through discipline. Precisely the qualities that had defined Solomon's guardian centuries earlier, and that would continue to shape the Templars' destiny in the centuries to come. The legends of Solomon's treasures have endured for millennia, whispered through the corridors of history, carried by pilgrims, scribes, and storytellers who understood that some truths are too powerful to reveal openly. These were not merely tales of gold, silver, and gemstones, though such material wealth certainly existed within the Temple of Solomon. The most potent treasures were thought to be artifacts imbued with knowledge, relics capable of revealing secrets about faith, the cosmos, and the very nature of existence. Among these were scrolls and codices containing wisdom too delicate, too dangerous, or too transformative to be shared freely, alongside objects whose symbolism and power were hidden even from those who would come to guard them centuries later. It was this dual nature of the treasures, both physical and metaphysical, that would shape the mission of the Templars long after Jerusalem had fallen into the hands of conquerors. To understand the significance of these treasures, it is necessary to imagine the Temple of Solomon not as a mere building but as a repository of the sacred, a place where divine insight was encoded in stone, in gold, and in carefully crafted instruments. Some accounts speak of the Ark of the Covenant, resplendent with gold and believed to contain the tablets of the law, a source of immense spiritual and possibly mystical power. Other texts hint at ceremonial objects, such as chalices, censers, and sacred vessels, each carefully consecrated and each carrying layers of symbolic meaning. Beyond the ceremonial, there were manuscripts and scrolls, some recording knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and architecture, others codifying rituals and moral instruction meant to guide future generations. These treasures were not merely hoarded wealth. They were instruments of continuity, a bridge between generations, a tangible connection to the covenant that Solomon had established centuries earlier. When the temple was sacked and the city overrun, much of this treasure vanished from the public record. Some of it was likely destroyed, lost in the chaos of war, fire, and exile. But according to legend and fragmentary evidence, a significant portion was spirited away by those who had been entrusted with its care. These were the early guardians, men whose knowledge, devotion, and discretion allowed them to conceal these relics in ways that would endure for centuries. They understood that physical concealment was not enough. The locations had to be encoded, protected, and hidden behind layers of secrecy, so that only the worthy could ever hope to find them. The mission was as much about survival as it was about protection, the survival of knowledge, of wisdom, and of a covenant that transcended time. It was into this hidden world that the Templars would eventually step, centuries later, as the Crusades drew them into the heart of the Holy Land. While their public mission was to protect pilgrims and fight on the front lines, their true inheritance was the continuation of a lineage entrusted with safeguarding Solomon's treasures. Every fortress they built, every manuscript they copied, every journey they undertook was potentially a step along a path laid down by the original guardians. The treasures themselves were more than objects. They were symbols, touchstones, and repositories of wisdom, intended to be accessed only by those disciplined enough to respect their power. This understanding infused the knights' actions with a gravity that is difficult to convey in modern terms. They were not merely fighting for land or faith. They were custodians of history, philosophy, and perhaps even cosmic insight. Some of the treasures were thought to be physical keys to understanding deeper truths. The Ark, for example, was said not only to contain the tablets of the law, but to hold properties that could illuminate spiritual and temporal order. Other relics, such as ceremonial swords, chalices, or sacred vessels, were believed to encode patterns of power, geometry, and ritual practice. The Templars' guardianship of these objects was therefore not a matter of prestige. It was a sacred trust, requiring vigilance, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to the preservation of knowledge. Every decision carried weight, for the wrong hands or the unworthy could bring destruction not only to the order but potentially to the societies that depended on the continuity of these truths. Legends surrounding the treasures also speak of hidden libraries, secret chambers, and lost cities. Scrolls and codices were encoded in complex ciphers, often requiring knowledge of ancient languages, geometry, and symbolism to interpret. Some manuscripts reportedly contained instructions for ritual practices, moral guidance, or esoteric wisdom derived from centuries of observation and contemplation. Others hinted at technologies or insights that could challenge conventional understanding of the world. For the Templars, discovering and preserving such materials became a central, though invisible, part of their mission. Each manuscript safeguarded was not merely a relic but a vessel of insight, a thread connecting the present to the sacred traditions of the past. The interplay between legend and historical record complicates our understanding of these treasures. Yet it is precisely this ambiguity that makes the story so compelling. On one level, the treasures were material, tangible, and valuable in the conventional sense. On another, they were repositories of knowledge, encoded with principles and teachings that could transform understanding if approached with insight and moral discipline. This duality created an aura of both reverence and danger around the treasures, attracting attention, speculation, and ultimately, envy. For centuries, kings, scholars, and conquerors sought to locate, possess, or interpret them, often failing because they lacked the ethical or intellectual preparation to do so. The Templars' role was to prevent such misappropriation, ensuring that the treasures were preserved for those capable of understanding their true significance. The human dimension of this mission is profound. Knights charged with guarding these treasures bore a burden that went far beyond their immediate duties. They were responsible not only for the physical objects but for the moral and intellectual integrity of the knowledge contained within them. The secrecy, discipline, and vigilance required were immense. They understood that failure could have far-reaching consequences, disrupting the delicate balance between faith, power, and wisdom. Each day, each patrol, each coded manuscript represented a step in a centuries-long chain of stewardship, linking men across generations in a shared responsibility that was invisible to the wider world. In some accounts, the treasures were rumored to contain keys to even greater mysteries, connections between the sacred and the mundane, techniques for understanding the divine, or insights into human potential. These claims are shrouded in legend, yet they reveal the enduring fascination that the treasures have held for centuries. They were more than gold and artifacts. They were metaphors, instruments of instruction, and guardians of truth. The Templars, by assuming responsibility for them, positioned themselves not only as warriors but as intermediaries between the temporal world and a higher, more profound order of understanding. Ultimately, the legend of Solomon's lost treasures illustrates the extraordinary complexity of the Templars' mission. They were men of action and faith, discipline and secrecy, bound together by a purpose that transcended immediate concerns. Their stewardship of these treasures was both practical and symbolic, a continuation of a covenant whose roots extended deep into the foundations of civilization. Every artifact preserved, every manuscript protected, every ritual performed was a step along a path of responsibility that began in the golden halls of Solomon's temple and extended through centuries of human history. The treasures themselves, though hidden and enigmatic, serve as a reminder that knowledge, power, and faith are intertwined. They are a testament to the vision of the original guardians and to the extraordinary responsibility assumed by the Templars. Their story challenges us to consider the fragility of wisdom, the consequences of secrecy and disclosure, and the human capacity to bear responsibility for truths larger than ourselves. The Templars' guardianship of Solomon's treasures was not simply an act of preservation. It was a moral and spiritual undertaking, one that demanded courage, discipline, and fidelity beyond measure. Betrayal is a subtle force, creeping through human history with the quiet persistence of a shadow. For the Templars, it was never a distant concept. It was a palpable presence, moving through the corridors of power, whispering through courts, and manifesting in the most unexpected places. These were men and women whose lives were entwined with the order, whose loyalty was assumed yet never guaranteed. In the complex political and social environment of medieval Europe, the Templars' wealth, influence, and secrecy made them magnets for envy and suspicion. Allies became rivals, confidants harbored hidden agendas, and even the closest relationships could conceal treachery. For an order whose very survival depended on discretion and trust, betrayal was not only a threat, it was a potential undoing of everything they had sworn to protect. The first signs of betrayal often emerged in subtle ways. Kings and nobles, initially reliant on the Templars for counsel, military support, and financial management, began to view their independence with unease. How could an organization bound by its own secret codes wield such power without accountability to the temporal authorities? Rumors circulated, inflating minor indiscretions into tales of conspiracy, and painting the knights as manipulators of hidden agendas. The very secrecy that had preserved Solomon's covenant now cast a shadow of doubt over the order's intentions, providing fertile ground for mistrust. These whispers of betrayal, often unspoken yet pervasive, began to undermine the carefully constructed balance between public duty and private guardianship. Within the order itself, tension simmered. The Templars were disciplined, bound by vows and a creed that demanded loyalty, yet they were human. They experienced fear, doubt, and conflicting loyalties, particularly as the stakes grew higher. As the order expanded across Europe, managing estates, wealth, and complex networks, the possibility of internal betrayal became real. Not all knights were equally committed to the higher mission. Some were swayed by personal ambition, desire, or fear. The guardianship of sacred treasures and hidden knowledge added an extraordinary weight to their responsibilities, and the pressure sometimes caused fractures. Even a single lapse in judgment or misaligned ambition could compromise the entire chain of secrecy, threatening not only individual knights but the mission itself. The political climate of the time intensified the danger. Monarchs, competing for power and resources, were acutely aware of the Templars' influence. Their fortresses were formidable, their wealth unmatched, and their allegiances often extended beyond the interests of any single kingdom. In this environment, betrayal could take many forms. Secret alliances with rivals, the leaking of sensitive information, or the subtle manipulation of perception to undermine the order's credibility. Those who sought to diminish the Templars' power often did so with a combination of cunning, intimidation, and moral argument, framing the order's independence and secrecy as evidence of corruption or heresy. Each whisper, each accusation, carried the potential to unravel decades of careful stewardship. The human cost of betrayal was most apparent during crises of trust. Knights and commanders were forced to make impossible choices, balancing loyalty to their brothers with obedience to external authorities, all while safeguarding knowledge that could reshape society. The very act of vigilance became a moral and psychological burden. The fear that one's actions might be misinterpreted, that secrets might be exposed, and that alliances might fail created a tense atmosphere where every decision carried weight far beyond the immediate. Knights were constantly tested, not only in battle but in judgment, discretion, and moral courage. A single betrayal could have cascading consequences, endangering lives, fortunes, and the sacred mission entrusted to them. Betrayal also took subtler forms, manifesting in envy, rumor, and misunderstanding. The Templars' rapid rise in wealth and influence made them targets for resentment. Monarchs coveted their lands, nobles envied their discipline, and clergy feared their independence. These social and political pressures created an environment in which loyalty could be compromised, intentionally or inadvertently. Knights had to navigate these currents carefully, recognizing that betrayal was rarely overt at first. It often began as a glimmer of doubt, a quiet misrepresentation, a shadowed comment that planted seeds of mistrust. And yet, the Templars' training, ritual, and secret creed provided some defense, instilling in them the ability to perceive intention, weigh evidence, and act with strategic foresight. Among the most dramatic betrayals were those orchestrated at the highest levels of power. Monarchs and church officials, threatened by the order's autonomy and secrecy, began to conspire against them, blending political maneuvering with moral accusation. Rumors of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals were circulated, casting the Templars as a threat not only to earthly authority but to spiritual orthodoxy. The combination of envy, fear, and ambition proved a potent weapon. It was a betrayal not only of trust but of perception, turning public opinion against the order and providing justification for persecution. This pattern, emerging slowly and methodically, would culminate in one of the most infamous and devastating attacks on the order in history. Yet betrayal was not only external. Within the order, knights occasionally faltered under the weight of secrecy, temptation, or moral conflict. Some were swayed by personal ambition, others by fear, and a few by the subtle promise of favor from powerful outsiders. Even the most disciplined knight faced the psychological strain of guarding knowledge whose importance far exceeded ordinary understanding. The Templars' strength lay not only in their swords but in their ability to resist such pressures, to maintain cohesion and loyalty even as forces of betrayal converged from both within and without. The human element of their mission, the struggle with doubt, fear, and temptation, was as significant as any military campaign. The consequences of betrayal were profound. It eroded trust, weakened alliances, and introduced uncertainty into a system that relied on discipline and predictability. Knights were forced to operate under constant vigilance, anticipating not only external threats but the possibility that loyalty could falter among their own brothers. The guardianship of sacred treasures, manuscripts, and hidden knowledge amplified the stakes, as any lapse could compromise not only the order but the continuity of a legacy that stretched back to Solomon's temple. Each betrayal, subtle or overt, carried moral, strategic, and spiritual weight, creating an environment in which vigilance was as essential as valor. Yet amid these shadows of treachery, the Templars also demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Their internal discipline, secret codes, and commitment to the hidden covenant allowed them to survive pressures that would have destroyed lesser organizations. They learned to anticipate betrayal, to interpret the motives of allies and adversaries alike, and to act decisively to preserve the integrity of their mission. This capacity for strategic and moral foresight became one of the defining features of the order, enabling them to navigate centuries of political intrigue, warfare, and human ambition. Even when betrayed, the Templars adapted, adjusted, and continued their work with remarkable persistence, a testament to the depth of their training and the gravity of their sacred mission. The story of betrayal within and around the Templars is not merely a tale of intrigue. It is a study of human nature under extraordinary circumstances. It highlights the tension between ambition and loyalty, fear and courage, secrecy and exposure. It underscores the complexity of managing power, influence, and knowledge in a world where perception can be as dangerous as force. And it provides context for understanding the eventual fall of the order, illustrating that even the most disciplined and dedicated organizations are vulnerable to the subtle, persistent currents of envy, suspicion, and betrayal. Ultimately, the Templars' experience with betrayal emphasizes the extraordinary stakes of their mission. They were not merely knights or custodians of wealth. They were guardians of a covenant whose significance transcended time, culture, and human ambition. Every whisper of treachery, every act of disloyalty, every miscalculation tested not only their martial skill but their moral fortitude, their judgment, and their capacity to preserve a sacred trust. In this crucible of human frailty and ambition, the Templars' character, discipline, and resilience were forged, shaping an order whose legend would endure for centuries. even as envy and betrayal set the stage for its most dramatic trials. The relationship between the Templars and the papacy was a delicate dance of devotion, utility, and unspoken tension. On the surface, the knights owed their allegiance to the Church, sworn to defend pilgrims, sacred sites, and Christendom itself. Yet their growing wealth, military might, and network of influence created an invisible line of autonomy that few secular or ecclesiastical authorities fully understood or controlled. To the popes, the Templars were both a blessing and a source of unease, a powerful instrument of spiritual and temporal authority, yet one whose independence made them unpredictable. Beneath the layers of ceremony, ritual, and loyalty, a quiet struggle for influence was already beginning to take shape, one that would ultimately determine the order's fate. The papacy relied on the Templars as much as kings did. They were the guardians of pilgrims crossing dangerous territories, the commanders of fortified castles that secured trade routes, and the organizers of complex logistical operations that extended from Jerusalem to the heart of Europe. Their reputation for discipline, bravery, and effectiveness was unmatched, and their presence provided a form of moral and military leverage that the Church could not easily replicate. In many ways, they acted as an extension of papal authority, carrying out missions that combined martial precision with religious devotion. Yet this dependence came at a cost. The popes could never fully dictate the order's movements, interpret its secrets, or control the subtle influence it exerted over monarchs and nobles alike. It is this independence that created tension. While the knights were outwardly obedient to the Church, they were also bound by their own internal codes, their secret creed, and the inherited wisdom of generations who had guarded Solomon's covenant. Their mission transcended the immediate concerns of earthly power. It was a covenantal responsibility that connected them to a lineage older than kingdoms, older than the Church itself. To the papacy, this invisible authority was both mysterious and threatening. The very secrecy that ensured the continuity of the Templars' mission made them an unpredictable element within the medieval hierarchy of power. Trust was essential, but it was tempered by caution and the latent fear that the knights might act in ways that served a higher purpose, one not entirely aligned with papal priorities. The Templars' fortresses and financial networks amplified this tension. They were strategically positioned across Europe and the Holy Land, controlling routes, estates, and resources that could rival those of kings. The Church, while aware of the order's loyalty, recognized that influence was not the same as obedience. The knights were disciplined, yes, but they were also autonomous operators, capable of making decisions that affected commerce, politics, and military campaigns without prior papal authorization. This autonomy, though necessary for operational efficiency, made the Templars a subject of both awe and apprehension within the Church hierarchy. Every fortress, every treasure chest, and every letter carried a dual significance, a testament to service and a reminder of independence. Beyond military and financial concerns, there was also the matter of knowledge. The Templars' secret creed, their rituals, and the hidden lineage of wisdom they preserved created an additional layer of tension. The Church did not fully understand the depth of what the knights were guarding. To some papal officials, this knowledge, concealed beneath layers of ritual and secrecy, was potentially threatening. If misinterpreted or exposed, it could challenge established doctrines or reveal truths that the Church preferred to keep contained. This fear was subtle but persistent, manifesting in inquiries, observations, and occasional interventions designed to assert control without overtly confronting the order's autonomy. The dynamic between the Templars and the papacy was further complicated by the political landscape of the time. Kings, nobles, and other religious orders all had stakes in the knights' influence and wealth. The Templars' allegiance to the Church provided them with legitimacy and protection, yet it also placed them in the center of a web of competing interests. The papacy had to navigate carefully, leveraging the order's strength without provoking resentment or rebellion. It was a delicate balance, a political tightrope on which both the knights and the Church walked, conscious that a misstep could have consequences for both the temporal and spiritual realms. Internal Church politics also played a role. Some officials admired the Templars, seeing them as indispensable instruments of faith and security. Others were wary, envious, or suspicious, perceiving the order as an autonomous force whose allegiance to Rome could be manipulated or even questioned. Rumors of hidden rituals, coded messages, and extraordinary discipline fed into these perceptions, amplifying fear and misunderstanding. Even without direct evidence, the mere existence of a secretive, powerful organization bound by its own internal laws was sufficient to provoke tension, suspicion, and, eventually, calculated intervention. Despite these pressures, the Templars maintained a remarkable balance between loyalty and autonomy. They continued to serve the Church faithfully, fulfilling their mission with rigor and precision. Their military campaigns were often in support of papal directives, yet their independent judgment allowed them to navigate challenges that rigid hierarchy alone could not manage. The Church relied on them not only as warriors but as stewards of knowledge, networks, and sacred responsibility. This dual role, obedient yet autonomous, was both the Order's strength and its vulnerability. It elevated them above ordinary military or religious organizations, but it also sowed the seeds of the mistrust and fear that would later erupt in dramatic and catastrophic ways. The tension between the Templars and the papacy was never openly declared but simmered beneath the surface of formal relations. Knights operated under papal sanction, yet their autonomy created anxiety among those who sought certainty and control. This dynamic is critical to understanding the events that followed. The growing scrutiny, the eventual accusations of heresy, and the systematic efforts by some church leaders to curtail, manipulate, or eliminate the order. What began as subtle unease would, over time, become a potent force of political maneuvering, betrayal, and persecution. Yet it is important to recognize that this tension was not one-sided. The Templars themselves were acutely aware of the dangers inherent in their visibility and power. They understood that every action, every accumulation of wealth or influence, every symbol or ritual could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or exploited. Their discipline and secrecy were responses to this awareness, strategies designed to protect both the order and the knowledge they guarded. In many ways, their relationship with the papacy was a mirror of their broader strategy. Maintain loyalty, project obedience, yet protect the invisible mission that transcended immediate authority. Ultimately, the Templars' uneasy relationship with the papacy illustrates the complexity of power, trust, and secrecy. It was not simply a matter of obedience or rivalry, faith or ambition. It was a dynamic negotiation, an ongoing calibration between authority and autonomy, revelation and concealment. The Knights' loyalty was real, but it was guided by a higher purpose that the Church could not fully command or comprehend. The resulting tension, while manageable for decades, foreshadowed the dramatic confrontations, accusations, and persecution that would eventually bring the order to its knees. In the shadows of this relationship lies a deeper truth. The Templars were not merely servants of earthly authority, but stewards of a covenant that preceded the papacy itself. Their power, influence, and secret knowledge created a unique position, one that combined devotion, autonomy, and moral responsibility in a way that few institutions, religious or secular, had ever achieved. The papacy, while recognizing their utility and loyalty, could never fully grasp the breadth of their mission. This unbridgeable gap between visible obedience and hidden purpose would become the crucible in which the fate of the Templars was ultimately forged, setting the stage for the trials, betrayals, and dramatic fall that would echo through history for centuries. As the Templars extended their reach beyond the Holy Land, their presence in Northern Europe became a defining chapter in their story. The landscapes were dramatically different from the sun-baked streets of Jerusalem. Dense forests, rolling hills, and cold, mist-laden rivers replaced the heat and dust of the desert. Yet these regions offered both opportunity and challenge. Kings and nobles were often eager for the protection, discipline, and expertise that the Templars could provide. Pilgrimage routes needed safeguarding, castles and fortresses required fortification, and political disputes demanded the influence of a disciplined, loyal, and strategically minded order. In this northern context, the Templars' combination of military prowess, financial acumen, and secret knowledge allowed them to thrive, establishing a network that would leave a lasting imprint on the region, both visible and hidden. The Order's expansion into Northern Europe was not merely a logistical or military undertaking. It was also deeply symbolic. The Templars were entering territories that had long been steeped in their own traditions, cultures, and religious practices. They needed to navigate local customs, integrate with regional politics, and build trust with communities unfamiliar with the Order's mission. Their success was rooted in discipline, adaptability, and an almost uncanny ability to blend overt military responsibility with the covert guardianship of knowledge inherited from Solomon's lineage. Each new settlement, each castle, each chapter house was meticulously planned, not just for defense or administration, but as part of a broader, invisible network of influence and secrecy that connected these northern holdings to the legacy of the Holy Land. The Templars' constructions in the north were remarkable for their sophistication and subtle symbolism. Fortresses, churches, and chapter houses were often designed with geometric precision, proportional alignment, and symbolic motifs that echoed ancient wisdom. To the untrained observer, they appeared as functional military installations, impressive and imposing, yet unremarkable beyond their practical purpose. To the initiated, however, these structures contained layers of meaning. Hidden chambers, secret passages, symbolic carvings, and alignments that reflected celestial patterns or encoded moral and philosophical principles. Every stone laid, every vault constructed, was a continuation of a tradition that linked the Order to the guardians of Solomon's temple centuries earlier. In addition to their architectural influence, the Templars' northern expansion also introduced a complex web of financial and administrative networks. Castles and estates were not merely defensive. They were centers of economic management, hubs of trade, and secure repositories for both material wealth and sacred knowledge. The Knights' experience in banking and logistics, honed through decades of managing estates, pilgrim deposits, and transcontinental communication, allowed them to establish a level of efficiency and organization unparalleled in the region. This practical power enhanced their influence, earning respect and loyalty from local rulers, while simultaneously sowing the seeds of envy and suspicion among those who viewed their independence as threatening. The legends that grew around the Templars in Northern Europe often reflect both awe and fear. Tales of secret chambers, hidden treasures, and coded symbols circulated widely, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes rooted in reality. Local communities spoke of knights who were as much philosophers and keepers of arcane knowledge as they were warriors. Some claimed that the Templars possessed relics and manuscripts that could reveal hidden truths, while others whispered of rituals that seemed strange, even frightening. These stories, whether entirely factual or amplified by legend, reinforced the perception that the Order was extraordinary, operating according to rules and purposes that transcended conventional understanding. The human dimension of this northern expansion is particularly compelling. The Templars were often outsiders, navigating unfamiliar climates, cultures, and political landscapes. They faced not only the physical challenges of warfare and fortification, but also the subtler challenges of diplomacy, cultural adaptation, and moral responsibility. They were entrusted with protecting pilgrims, managing estates, and resolving disputes, all while safeguarding sacred knowledge whose significance was invisible to the wider world. This delicate balancing act required extraordinary discipline, judgment, and courage. Each knight became a bridge between the known and the hidden, between local authority and the deeper mission of the Order. The northern territories also offered opportunities to further the Order's covert mission. Castles and chapter houses were often positioned strategically along trade routes, rivers, or high vantage points, creating a network that could serve both defensive and observational purposes. Manuscripts, relics, and encoded knowledge were dispersed carefully across these holdings, ensuring redundancy and protection against potential loss. The integration of these physical, financial, and symbolic elements allowed the Templars to maintain continuity and influence even far from the Holy Land, creating a lattice of power and secrecy that would endure long after individual knights had passed. Yet the northern expansion was not without risk. The very visibility of their accomplishments, impressive fortresses, disciplined troops, and effective management, made the Templars targets for envy and political maneuvering. Local rulers occasionally questioned their loyalty, fearing that an order with such resources and autonomy could challenge secular authority. Rumors of hidden rituals, secret wealth, An unexplained influence intensified these suspicions, creating a subtle but persistent undercurrent of tension. The Templars' ability to navigate these pressures relied heavily on their discipline, strategic foresight, and adherence to the secret creed that guided every aspect of their conduct. The mystical aura surrounding their northern constructions contributed to the Templars' enduring legacy. Some structures were rumored to conceal secret chambers, tunnels, or repositories of knowledge, their true purposes hidden from view. Symbols carved into stone or wood were often overlooked by casual observers, but encoded guidance for those trained to interpret them. This interplay between the visible and the hidden, the ordinary and the extraordinary, reinforced the Order's identity as both warriors and custodians of ancient wisdom. To the initiated, every fortress, manuscript, and ritual contained echoes of a lineage stretching back to Solomon, connecting distant northern lands to the sacred heart of the Holy Land. The Order's northern expansion also illustrates the universality of their mission. While the Templars had been forged in the deserts of the Levant, they were capable of adapting their discipline, knowledge, and strategies to diverse environments. This adaptability was not merely practical. It was philosophical. The guardianship of sacred knowledge, the protection of pilgrims, and the cultivation of moral and intellectual rigor were principles that could be applied across cultures, climates, and centuries. Their ability to preserve continuity, even in the face of environmental and political challenges, underscores the extraordinary nature of the Order and the depth of their commitment to the covenant they inherited. As the Templars' influence spread, so too did their reputation. Tales of their discipline, courage, and mysterious practices permeated local folklore, blending historical fact with legend. Some spoke of knights appearing suddenly in defense of a village. Others whispered about hidden libraries or treasures concealed within remote fortresses. These stories served multiple purposes. They reinforced the Templars' authority, deterred potential threats, and maintained the aura of mystery that was central to the Order's identity. The combination of practical power and symbolic mystique ensured that the Templars were respected, feared, and remembered long after their presence had become a permanent feature of the northern landscape. In the end, the Templars' expansion into northern Europe was not simply a matter of territory or logistics. It was an extension of their sacred mission. Castles, estates, and chapter houses were more than functional structures. They were nodes in a vast, invisible network of influence, knowledge, and guardianship. Each establishment reflected the Order's discipline, strategic acumen, and adherence to principles that connected them to a lineage older than kingdoms. Through these northern holdings, the Templars continued the work begun in the deserts of the Holy Land, preserving sacred knowledge, guiding moral and intellectual development, and maintaining a balance between visible service and hidden purpose that would define their legacy for centuries to come. The night of the arrests was unlike any the Templars had experienced. Across France, under the cloak of darkness, torches flickered against stone walls, their light trembling like uncertain flames of fate. Word had spread, whispered in shadows and carried by anxious messengers, that the king's men would move to strike at the heart of the Order. The streets were silent, yet charged with tension, as if the air itself anticipated the storm. Within the chapter houses and fortresses, knights slept uneasily, senses sharpened by centuries of vigilance, unaware that the danger they sensed was not of the battlefield but of betrayal close to home. The balance between loyalty, secrecy, and power, so carefully maintained for decades, was about to fracture in ways that no sword, strategy, or sacred oath could prevent. It began in the early hours, when groups of men, organized and relentless, descended upon the Templars' holdings. The sound of heavy boots on stone echoed through quiet courtyards. Doors were broken and fortified gates were challenged. The knights awoke not to the cry of alarm from an enemy army but to the sight of familiar faces carrying the king's seal. Forces sanctioned by authority yet executing a will that betrayed trust, honor, and decades of disciplined service. Many knights initially hesitated, unable to comprehend the scope of the betrayal. The men they had served beside, the rulers who had relied on their loyalty and counsel, were now instruments of their undoing. Fear rippled through the chapter houses, mingling with disbelief, anger, and the deep, silent sorrow of knowing that centuries of careful stewardship were about to be violently interrupted. The arrests were swift, precise, and terrifying in their efficiency. Knights were dragged from beds, chains clinked as they were bound, and cries of protest echoed through dim corridors. Those who resisted were met with the harsh authority of soldiers who had been briefed not for negotiation but for execution of the king's orders. Even the most seasoned knights, trained for combat, found themselves ill-prepared for the psychological and emotional weight of this assault. They were not confronting a foreign enemy, nor were they defending pilgrims on a battlefield. They were facing the collapse of trust, the rupture of alliances, and the betrayal of a system that had defined their lives. The sacred spaces that had sheltered secrets, manuscripts, and treasures now became prisons. Their walls witnessed to anguish, confusion, and the dawning realization of impending catastrophe. The king's motivation was complex. Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order due to loans and political obligations, saw the Templars' wealth and independence as a threat. Their influence over kings, nobles, and the church created tension that he feared could undermine his own authority. The combination of envy, fear, and ambition led him to orchestrate a campaign that was as legal as it was morally dubious. The charges against the Templars, heresy, blasphemy, and occult practices, were carefully framed to justify action in the eyes of the public and the church. Yet beneath the formal accusations lay a more human and calculated betrayal. The seizure of wealth, the neutralization of a potential rival, and the destruction of an order whose influence Philip could neither control nor fully comprehend. The knights themselves struggled to reconcile the enormity of the moment with the principles that had guided them for decades. Many were bewildered by the sudden accusations, unable to fathom how devotion, discipline, and service could be construed as heresy. Others, aware of the precarious balance between power and perception, sensed that the seeds of suspicion had been nurtured for years, slowly eroding trust and creating fertile ground for this attack. The internal struggle was compounded by the knowledge that their secret mission, their stewardship of hidden knowledge and sacred relics, was now exposed to unprecedented risk. What had survived centuries of careful concealment was suddenly vulnerable, and the knights understood that the consequences could extend far beyond themselves, threatening the continuity of a covenant that had begun in the golden halls of Solomon's temple. Interrogations began almost immediately. Knights were questioned, pressured, and coerced into confession. Some resisted, clinging to the principles and vows that had defined their lives, while others, broken by fear, torture, or despair, revealed fragments of ritual, code, or doctrine. The psychological landscape of the night was harrowing. Men trained for battle and secrecy found themselves defenseless against a combination of authority, manipulation, and fear. Each confession, coerced or otherwise, became another tool in the king's campaign to delegitimize the order, to turn public opinion, and to justify the seizure of wealth and influence. The knight's silence, discipline, and courage were tested to the limits, revealing both the strength and fragility of human character under extreme duress. The physical environment contributed to the drama of the night. Courtyards, fortresses, and stone halls, built for defense and secrecy, became scenes of tension and fear. The knights moved through spaces that had long served as repositories of knowledge and sacred relics, now transformed into prisons. Shadows danced along walls where sacred symbols had been etched, their meanings obscured but no less potent. The very architecture, which had once safeguarded secrets, now witnessed their unraveling. The juxtaposition of these tangible spaces, symbols of power, faith, and wisdom, with the intangible reality of betrayal heightened the sense of loss, despair, and impending doom that hung in the air. Beyond the immediate violence, there was also the wider societal impact. News of the arrests spread quickly, fueling rumor, speculation, and fear. Allies questioned their loyalties, while ordinary citizens struggled to understand how an order so revered could be accused of heresy. The Templars, once symbols of faith, courage, and moral discipline, became figures of suspicion and intrigue. This rapid shift in perception, orchestrated with careful calculation, amplified the psychological impact of the arrests, demonstrating the potency of betrayal not only on individuals but on the collective consciousness of a society. Despite the chaos, some knights managed to act with foresight, concealing relics, manuscripts, and coded knowledge that could survive the assault. Others, aware of the broader implications, focused on preserving life, maintaining internal cohesion, and safeguarding the essence of the Order's mission. These actions, carried out under extreme pressure, reflected the depth of training, discipline, and moral fortitude that had defined the Templars for generations. Even in the face of overwhelming betrayal, the commitment to continuity, secrecy, and duty endured, a testament to the resilience and enduring purpose of the Order. The Night of the Arrests was not merely a historical event. It was a crucible in which loyalty, courage, and morality were tested to their limits. It was a collision of human ambition, fear, and power, where centuries of trust and discipline were upended by envy, political calculation, and the relentless pursuit of authority. The knights faced not only the threat of imprisonment and execution, but the potential unraveling of a sacred mission that had survived for generations. Every sound, every shadow, every clink of chains carried the weight of history, shaping the destiny of an order whose influence would echo long after the events of that night had passed. And yet, even in the midst of this profound betrayal, the Order's legacy would endure. The courage, discipline, and moral rigor demonstrated on that night became part of the narrative of the Templars' identity. Their secret knowledge, carefully concealed and transmitted, survived to influence future generations, maintaining the continuity of a covenant that stretched back to the guardians of Solomon's Temple. The night was a turning point, a dark and dramatic chapter, yet it also underscored the enduring power of human commitment to principle, the resilience of secrecy, and the extraordinary responsibility carried by men who understood that some truths are too powerful to reveal and too vital to lose. The torment of the Templars began in the quiet aftermath of the arrests, a shadow that crept slowly into the minds and bodies of men who had dedicated their lives to discipline, secrecy, and sacred duty. The initial shock of betrayal had left them reeling, but it was only the beginning. In the dimly lit chambers of the king's prisons, where torches flickered against cold stone walls, the knights faced a different kind of battle. A battle not waged with swords or shields, but with pain, fear, and the relentless probing of human endurance. These were men trained to face death in combat. Yet the cruelty of psychological manipulation and physical coercion was a force unlike any battlefield they had known, testing both their courage and the moral fiber of their souls. Torture, as employed against the Templars, was systematic and deliberate. Knights were bound, suspended, and subjected to methods designed to break their bodies and extract confessions. The techniques were varied: straining of limbs, whipping, and the application of pressure designed to incapacitate without immediate death. Yet it was not merely the physical agony that constituted the ordeal. It was the erosion of certainty, the relentless questioning, and the insinuation of guilt that attacked the mind. Each interrogator, empowered by royal authority and the weight of fear, sought to dismantle the knights' resolve, to force them into betraying not only their order, but the sacred mission that had guided them for decades. The confessions that emerged from these chambers were often the product of extreme duress rather than truth. Knights were questioned about heretical practices, secret rituals, and unholy alliances, charges that in reality reflected the fears and ambitions of those in power rather than the reality of the order. Under pressure, some knights recounted exaggerated or false practices, believing that confession might spare their lives, or at least end their immediate suffering. Others resisted entirely, clinging to the principles that had governed their lives, even as the instruments of coercion sought to break them. Each act of confession or silence became a measure of the knight's endurance, a test of moral and spiritual fortitude that transcended ordinary human experience. What made these trials particularly devastating was the psychological subtlety of the torment. Beyond the physical methods, interrogators employed manipulation, deception, and intimidation to create isolation and doubt. Knights were told that their brothers had confessed, that the order had already failed, and that resistance was futile. This psychological pressure was designed not only to extract information but to fracture the cohesion of the order, to undermine loyalty and trust, and to create an atmosphere in which moral judgment became clouded by fear. Even the most disciplined knight found himself grappling with questions of conscience. To protect the order, one might endure pain silently, yet such endurance risked unimaginable suffering. To speak, one could preserve life at the cost of integrity. The Templars' training and secret creed, however, provided a measure of resistance. They had been disciplined to resist fear, to maintain clarity of mind under pressure, and to act in accordance with principles greater than themselves. Meditation, ritual, and moral instruction had prepared them, in part, for the possibility that their devotion would be tested in extreme circumstances. This preparation allowed some knights to withstand hours, even days of interrogation without surrendering the deepest secrets of their mission. They understood that the preservation of sacred knowledge and covenantal trust was paramount, and that the endurance of suffering was a measure of loyalty to something far larger than their individual lives. Despite this preparation, the psychological toll was immense. Knights endured hallucinations, extreme exhaustion, and the creeping sense that time had lost all meaning. The mind, starved of certainty and assaulted by pain, began to fracture in ways that physical discipline alone could not repair. Many recorded or later recounted the experience as a descent into a landscape of fear and doubt, a place where the familiar principles of order, morality, and duty were suspended in the shadow of coercion. It was a liminal space, a realm of human fragility and resilience, where the strongest wills were tested and where the boundaries between truth, perception, and survival became blurred. The ordeal of torture was compounded by isolation. Knights were often held apart, unable to communicate with one another, creating uncertainty about the loyalty and fate of their brothers. The silence was deliberate, designed to amplify fear and to encourage confessions by making each individual feel abandoned and vulnerable. In these moments, the psychological burden became almost unbearable. Men who had faced armies, sieges, and death on the battlefield found themselves trapped in a prison not of stone alone but of doubt, despair, and relentless pressure. Their minds were assaulted as methodically as their bodies, and the toll was as profound as the physical injuries inflicted. Religious faith, while a source of strength, became both a refuge and a challenge. Knights prayed, meditated, and drew upon the moral and spiritual lessons of their creed to sustain their courage. Yet the accusations they faced, blasphemy, heresy, and violation of sacred oaths, attacked the very foundation of that faith. They were asked to betray not only their order but the principles that had guided their lives and justified their sacrifices. This duality created a tension between devotion and survival, forcing knights to navigate a landscape of ethical ambiguity where every choice carried profound consequences. The resilience shown by the Templars in these chambers was extraordinary. Many knights emerged from torture without betraying the most sacred secrets, preserving manuscripts, relics, and knowledge that would survive centuries. Others, broken by fear or pain, revealed fragments. Yet even these admissions were often partial, encoded, or ambiguous, reflecting the ongoing struggle to protect the core of the Order's mission. In all cases, the psychological and spiritual dimensions of endurance were as crucial as the physical. Pain, fear, and coercion were tools designed to fracture, yet the discipline, moral courage, and preparation instilled over decades allowed many knights to resist completely or mitigate the damage to the covenant they had sworn to protect. This period of interrogation, torture, and forced confession became a defining moment in the history of the Templars. It demonstrated the fragility of human institutions under the combined pressure of fear, ambition, and authority, yet it also highlighted the extraordinary capacity of individuals to endure suffering in the service of a higher purpose. The knights' responses, whether through silence, coded confession, or quiet endurance, reflected an understanding that their mission transcended personal survival. They were, in the most profound sense, stewards of a legacy, and their trials tested not only the body but the integrity of the covenant itself. Ultimately, the torment of these knights underscores the paradox of their existence. They were men trained to face death in battle, yet vulnerable to the subtler, more insidious forms of human cruelty. Physical discipline, moral training, and spiritual devotion allowed some to withstand horrors that defied imagination, preserving the essence of an order that centuries of persecution could not erase. The chambers of interrogation, the instruments of coercion, and the shadows of betrayal became crucibles of endurance, forging a narrative of courage, discipline, and fidelity that continues to echo through history, a testament to the human capacity to preserve principle in the face of overwhelming adversity. The trials of the Templars were a stage upon which fear, power, and human ambition converged, a theater where history itself became a weapon. Unlike the battlefield, where strength and strategy were paramount, the courtroom was a place of perception, manipulation, and psychological warfare. Knights who had once moved with certainty, executing the sacred mission of their order, now faced an environment where every word, every gesture, every hesitation could be interpreted as guilt. The physical threat had been joined by the weight of accusation, the relentless scrutiny of authority, and the ever-present knowledge that centuries of dedication could be dismissed by the stroke of a pen. These trials were meticulously orchestrated. Legal procedures, ostensibly designed to uncover truth, were often twisted to serve the interests of kings and papal officials who feared the Templars' influence. Charges of heresy, blasphemy, and immoral conduct were leveled with precision, exploiting the order's secrecy and the misconceptions surrounding their rituals. Even the most devout knight could appear suspect when subjected to interrogation by men who neither understood the order's internal logic nor recognized the subtle distinctions between discipline and sacrilege. The courtroom became a battlefield of perception, where skill with words, composure under pressure, and the ability to navigate manipulation were as critical as any swordsmanship ever had been. The psychological pressure on the knights was immense. Those who had endured torture and forced confessions now faced a new form of coercion. The relentless exposure of their lives, principles, and actions to judgment by peers, authorities, and the public. They were compelled to explain not only their conduct but the very ethos that had guided the order for decades. Questions were designed to confuse, to provoke doubt, and to undermine the moral certainty that had been the foundation of their discipline. Knights found themselves walking a tightrope, balancing the protection of sacred knowledge against the imperative to respond to authority, aware that any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Evidence presented during these trials was often manipulated or misleading. Interrogators relied on coerced confessions, misinterpretations of rituals, and testimonies extracted under duress to construct a narrative of guilt. The courts were a crucible not of justice, but of perception, in which the objective truth of the Templars' mission was obscured by politics, fear, and envy. Documents that had been innocuous or symbolic were twisted into allegations of heresy. Actions that had been acts of loyalty, discipline, or moral courage were reinterpreted as evidence of wrongdoing. For the knights, the challenge was monumental: to maintain integrity while defending themselves against a system designed to overwhelm and manipulate. The human dimension of these trials cannot be overstated. Knights were forced to confront not only external authority but internal doubt. Having endured betrayal, torture, and isolation, they faced the profound challenge of reconciling their own understanding of loyalty, morality, and mission with the accusations leveled against them. Some struggled with guilt, wondering whether any misstep or misunderstanding could be construed as betrayal. Others maintained unwavering faith in the order's principles, using them as an anchor in the storm of scrutiny. This psychological and moral pressure was relentless, a crucible that tested the very essence of the Templars' identity. Political maneuvering was inseparable from the legal proceedings. Monarchs, threatened by the order's wealth and autonomy, used the trials as instruments to seize assets, diminish influence, and reassert control. The papacy, while outwardly invested in due process, was also concerned with preserving authority and avoiding scandal. The courts became arenas in which political calculation often outweighed justice, where charges were as much about consolidating power as determining truth. The Templars, trained for military discipline but unprepared for such intricate manipulations of law and perception, faced an environment in which victory was nearly impossible. The very mechanisms designed to uphold moral and spiritual order were exploited to dismantle the knights' influence and to obscure the covenant they had been entrusted to protect. Despite these pressures, the Templars demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Many knights maintained composure under interrogation, carefully choosing words and gestures to protect the order's secrets while appearing cooperative within the legal framework. They navigated the courtroom with strategic foresight, aware that each response could influence not only their own fate, but the preservation of the order's legacy. Their discipline, cultivated over decades, allowed them to endure scrutiny and manipulation, reinforcing the continuity of a mission that stretched back to the guardians of Solomon's temple. Even in the face of a system rigged against them, the Knights' commitment to principle, secrecy, and moral duty remained remarkably intact. The trials also revealed the complexity of human judgment. Judges and inquisitors were often caught between the demands of authority, political pressure, and their own conscience. Some were convinced of the Knights' guilt by the orchestration of coerced evidence and the weight of rumor. Others, skeptical of the charges, sought to interpret testimony with nuance, aware that the Knights' discipline and secrecy made simple understanding difficult. This interplay of perception, manipulation, and doubt created an environment where truth was slippery, where justice was contingent on interpretation, and where the moral and spiritual resilience of the Templars was constantly tested. Throughout the trials, the Order's internal cohesion became a critical source of strength. Knights supported one another, maintaining loyalty and discipline even as external forces sought to isolate and undermine them. This solidarity was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the moral framework that had guided the Order for centuries. It allowed them to withstand not only the immediate pressures of the courtroom but the broader campaign to destroy the Order's reputation, seize its assets, and dismantle its influence. In this context, the trials were as much a test of community and shared purpose as they were of individual endurance and moral fortitude. The ultimate tragedy of the trials lies in the way history itself became a weapon. The narratives constructed in courtrooms, the selective use of evidence, and the manipulation of public perception served to rewrite the Order's story. Actions that had been honorable, courageous, and disciplined were transformed into allegations of heresy and corruption. Rituals that had been symbolic and morally instructive were recast as evidence of secret transgression. In this process, the Templars' centuries-long mission to preserve sacred knowledge and uphold moral discipline was obscured, reframed by those who sought to control the narrative. It was a powerful demonstration of how history can be manipulated, how truth can be twisted by fear, ambition, and authority. Yet even as the Order faced legal, political, and psychological assault, the resilience of the Knights ensured that their core mission endured. Manuscripts, relics, and knowledge were preserved, often hidden in ways that ensured continuity despite the collapse of public legitimacy. The trials, while devastating, could not erase centuries of discipline, moral rigor, and the guardianship of wisdom. The Templars' ability to navigate the manipulation of history and power, maintaining secrecy and integrity under immense pressure, is a testament to their enduring commitment to a mission that transcended temporal authority and personal survival. In the end, the trials of the Templars were not only legal proceedings, they were crucibles in which the Order's character, discipline, and spiritual resilience were tested to the limit. They reveal the intersection of human ambition, fear, and the manipulation of perception, illustrating the extraordinary pressures faced by an institution entrusted with secrets too powerful to be revealed casually. Even as the legal system sought to unravel the Order, the Knights' moral fortitude, strategic foresight, and commitment to principle ensured that the covenant they had inherited would survive, continuing to shape history long after the last gavel fell. Even in the face of betrayal, torture, and orchestrated trials, the story of the Templars did not end with their arrests. Some knights, bound by courage, cunning, and unwavering loyalty to their sacred mission, found ways to escape the immediate grasp of authority. These were not chaotic, desperate flights, but calculated movements guided by years of discipline, foresight, and knowledge inherited from centuries of guardianship. The Templars' understanding of secrecy, encoded maps, and hidden pathways, combined with their network of loyal allies, enabled a number of them to disappear from the public eye while safeguarding critical knowledge and relics. It was an extraordinary testament to the resilience of an Order whose mission transcended fear, imprisonment, and mortality itself. The escapes were often executed with meticulous planning. Knights who had survived the first waves of arrests knew that the Order's continuity depended on their ability to evade capture while maintaining secrecy. Safe houses, hidden passages, and loyal contacts across Europe became vital lifelines. Knowledge of secret routes, symbols, and hidden markers, developed over generations and integrated into the very architecture of Templar holdings, allowed these men to navigate perilous territories with precision. Each escape was both a physical and intellectual feat, combining martial skill with strategic foresight, intuition, and an intimate understanding of human behavior. Every decision carried weight. A misstep could mean death, capture, or the loss of the knowledge entrusted to them. These fleeing knights did not scatter randomly. They moved deliberately, often seeking remote monasteries, secluded castles, or loyal estates where the Order's secrets could be preserved. Some joined other religious or military institutions temporarily, carefully maintaining appearances while ensuring that manuscripts, relics, and encoded knowledge remained protected. Others traveled through forests, mountains, and rivers, using concealed paths and hidden symbols to guide their journeys. Their movements were a combination of survival and mission continuity, each step designed to preserve the integrity of the Order and protect the hidden covenant they had inherited from Solomon's guardians. The survival of these knights was also a psychological endeavor. Having endured torture and betrayal, they were acutely aware of the dangers posed by human ambition and suspicion. Paranoia became a tool for survival. They assumed that friends could be coerced, that allies might betray them under pressure, and that the external authorities would stop at nothing to seize knowledge and assets. This heightened awareness reinforced their discipline, sharpened their strategic thinking, and instilled a level of caution that few contemporary soldiers or monks could have matched. Each encounter, each choice, each interaction was measured against the risk of exposure, the potential compromise of secrets, and the moral responsibility they bore to generations past and future. In addition to physical evasion, these knights also engaged in the preservation of knowledge in ways that would endure long after their own lifetimes. Manuscripts were hidden in caves, crypts, and remote estates, often encoded with symbols and ciphers that could only be interpreted by those initiated into the Order's traditions. Sacred relics, treasures, and ceremonial objects were concealed with equal care, their locations often known only to a trusted few. This was not mere hoarding. It was the careful stewardship of knowledge and power, a deliberate attempt to ensure that the covenant of Solomon's guardians would survive even in the face of persecution, scandal, and systemic dismantling of the Order. The Knights' movements and preservation strategies were often intertwined with emerging networks of secret societies, loyal allies, and sympathetic institutions. Monasteries, abbeys, and remote estates provided not only shelter but also resources, intelligence, and communication networks. In some cases, local rulers, scholars, or clergy sympathetic to the Templars offered protection, understanding the extraordinary value of the knowledge the Order guarded. This web of support allowed fleeing knights to continue their mission covertly, passing down manuscripts, symbols, and teachings to trusted individuals who could carry the legacy forward. These clandestine operations required extraordinary coordination, trust, and moral discernment, as any compromise could have catastrophic consequences for the entire Order. The secrecy and discipline of the Templars ensured that even in dispersion, the essence of their mission remained intact. The knights who survived the purge were not simply fugitives. They were custodians, teachers, and strategists, preserving continuity in a world that sought to erase them. Each decision to hide a manuscript, protect a relic, or encode knowledge in a symbol was a conscious act of moral courage and strategic foresight. These actions underscore the extraordinary resilience of an Order whose identity was defined as much by intellectual and spiritual rigor as by martial prowess. The survival of hidden knowledge also demonstrates the continuity of the Templars' intellectual and spiritual inheritance. The manuscripts and relics preserved by fleeing knights contained encoded wisdom, ritual knowledge, and historical records that linked them to Solomon's guardians and the ancient covenant. Some manuscripts detailed symbolic systems, moral principles, or philosophical frameworks. Others contained practical knowledge related to architecture, mathematics, or strategy. Each piece of preserved knowledge was carefully hidden, encoded, and transmitted, ensuring that the order's influence could persist even in the absence of centralized authority or formal recognition. Legends surrounding the surviving knights speak of secret councils, hidden monasteries, and remote estates where knowledge was transmitted and encoded for future generations. These narratives suggest that the order, while publicly dismantled, continued to operate covertly, maintaining continuity in ways that historians have only begun to piece together. Symbols, rituals, and encoded manuscripts became the lifeblood of a clandestine tradition, ensuring that the moral, spiritual, and intellectual legacy of the Templars could endure despite persecution. In this way, the survival of a few determined individuals preserved an entire covenant, connecting generations across centuries and safeguarding a lineage of wisdom that might otherwise have been lost to time. The human element of these survival strategies is profound. Knights had to balance fear, resourcefulness, and morality, making decisions with consequences that extended far beyond their own lives. Every manuscript preserved, every relic hidden, and every secret communicated represented a moral choice, a decision to protect knowledge for the benefit of future generations rather than seek personal safety or recognition. The stakes were immense, and the risks unparalleled. Yet these knights, trained for centuries in discipline, secrecy, and moral judgment, rose to the challenge, ensuring that the covenant they had inherited remained intact despite the collapse of the public order. Even as the world sought to erase them, the Templars' methods of preservation and concealment laid the foundation for centuries of legend, myth, and clandestine influence. Future generations, unaware of the specifics of the order's activities, would nonetheless encounter echoes of their work in architecture, symbolism, and the surviving manuscripts that emerged in Europe and beyond. The survival of the order's knowledge and influence is a testament to the extraordinary foresight, discipline, and courage of knights who, even in the shadow of betrayal and persecution, remained steadfast in their commitment to a covenant larger than themselves. In the final analysis, the escape and survival of these knights illustrate the extraordinary resilience of human spirit and intellect under extreme duress. They were men who had faced torture, betrayal, and persecution, yet found ways to preserve both life and legacy. Their discipline, strategic foresight, and moral courage allowed them to maintain the continuity of a covenant that stretched back to the guardians of Solomon's temple, ensuring that knowledge, wisdom, and sacred trust endured even when the visible order had been shattered. The Templars' survival, hidden yet persistent, became a living testament to the power of secrecy, fidelity, and the extraordinary capacity of humans to protect what is most precious in the face of overwhelming adversity. Even after the visible order of the Templars had been shattered, their presence continued to resonate in hidden and subtle ways across Europe. The knights who survived, those who had escaped imprisonment and preserved manuscripts, relics, and coded knowledge, became the invisible architects of a legacy that would ripple through centuries. They operated in the shadows, moving silently among cities, abbeys, and isolated estates, carrying the weight of a covenant that was older than kingdoms, older than the church itself. Every manuscript hidden, every symbol preserved, every secret transmitted became part of a living network that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, influencing the development of societies, ideas, and secret traditions that would endure long after their public presence had vanished. Rumors of their survival spread quickly, fueled by awe, fear, and the inherent mystique of the order. Stories circulated of knights appearing mysteriously to aid a town, advise a ruler, or protect a sacred site. Some whispered that these men had access to knowledge and power that exceeded human comprehension, relics that could illuminate hidden truths or reveal insights into divine order. Others spoke of secret assemblies in forests, mountains, or remote monasteries, where surviving Templars continued to study, preserve, and transmit the wisdom they had inherited. These tales, blending fact and myth, ensured that the memory of the order endured even as its formal structures had been dismantled, sowing the seeds of legend that would grow for centuries. The surviving knights also inspired the formation of new, clandestine networks, societies that echoed the discipline, secrecy, and moral rigor of the Templars. Some of these networks operated under the guise of monastic orders, while others assumed the appearance of scholarly societies or guilds. Their purpose was consistent: to safeguard knowledge, cultivate discipline and moral judgment, and maintain a lineage of wisdom that could not be preserved openly. These organizations, though separate from the original order, carried the essence of the Templars' mission. Manuscripts, symbols, and coded rituals were transmitted, often obliquely, ensuring that the lessons of the order would not be lost to time. In this way, the influence of the Templars extended far beyond their immediate context, embedding itself within the intellectual, spiritual, and social fabric of Europe. One of the most intriguing aspects of these secretive movements was their adaptability. The Knights, having endured betrayal, persecution, and systemic dismantling, had learned to operate under conditions of extreme caution and discretion. They transmitted knowledge incrementally, through coded messages, allegories, and ritual, ensuring that only those prepared by discipline and moral integrity could access the deepest insights. Manuscripts were copied and hidden in libraries, monasteries, and private collections. Symbols were carved into architecture, woven into tapestries, and encoded in objects, preserving meaning for those who knew how to interpret them. This approach allowed the survival of a vast body of knowledge, even as political, social, and religious authorities sought to suppress the order entirely. Legends suggest that some surviving Templars traveled far beyond Europe, carrying relics, manuscripts, and coded wisdom with them to distant lands. Their journeys were both practical and symbolic. Practical, in the sense of securing and preserving knowledge. Symbolic, in the sense of maintaining continuity, ritual, and the hidden covenant that had guided their order for centuries. These movements facilitated the spread of influence, creating invisible threads that connected disparate regions and societies. Even in exile, the Templars' principles, discipline, secrecy, moral rigor, and guardianship of knowledge, remained intact, forming the foundation for the mysterious and enduring reputation that the order would acquire over centuries. The legends surrounding the surviving knights were often amplified by the very secrecy they maintained. Local populations, aware of the knights' discreet presence but unaware of their true mission, attributed extraordinary abilities, insight, or influence to them. Some accounts speak of knights appearing at crucial moments to resolve disputes, avert conflict, or protect sacred sites. Others describe secret councils where manuscripts, relics, and encoded wisdom were studied and transmitted. These legends, while not always verifiable, reflect the enduring perception of the Templars as guardians of something far greater than themselves, custodians of knowledge that transcended ordinary understanding. The survival of the Templars' knowledge also contributed to the formation of later secret societies. Freemasonry, Rosicrucian movements, and other esoteric orders, while developing in different historical contexts, appear to have inherited symbolic, ritualistic, and philosophical elements reminiscent of Templar practice. Rituals emphasizing moral discipline, the careful transmission of knowledge, and the symbolic representation of spiritual truths echo the principles that had guided the Templars for centuries. While historical evidence is fragmentary and often speculative, the parallels suggest that the surviving knights had a profound and lasting impact on the intellectual and mystical currents of Europe, embedding their values, principles, and methods into the foundation of future movements. The moral and spiritual dimension of these secret networks was profound. Surviving Templars were not merely protecting manuscripts and relics. They were safeguarding a covenant of responsibility, moral discipline, and wisdom. Each decision to transmit knowledge, to encode meaning, or to guide a successor carried ethical weight, reflecting the enduring principles of the order. This was not an abstract exercise. It was a lived experience, a rigorous and disciplined continuation of a mission that required both intellect and moral integrity. Knights trained in secrecy and discernment became mentors, guiding the next generation of initiates through lessons that combined practical skill, moral responsibility, and symbolic understanding. The survival and dispersion of these knights also underscore the extraordinary adaptability of the Templar strategies. Even when faced with systematic persecution, they were able to preserve the integrity of their mission by hiding, encoding, and transmitting knowledge with remarkable foresight. The combination of secrecy, moral discipline, and strategic foresight allowed the Templars' influence to endure, even when the visible structures of the order had been dismantled. It is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the capacity of disciplined human effort to preserve something greater than any single individual or generation. Ultimately, the legends of surviving Templars, secret societies, and preserved knowledge demonstrate the enduring power of an order whose mission was both practical and profoundly symbolic. They reveal a pattern in which discipline, secrecy, and moral courage were as crucial as military skill, creating a legacy that could survive betrayal, persecution, and the erosion of public authority. These knights were not simply exiled warriors. They were custodians of a hidden truth, moving through the shadows, transmitting wisdom, and influencing the world in ways that were invisible to the broader public but monumental in their cumulative impact. The ripple effects of these surviving knights are still felt, subtly, in architecture, ritual, symbolic language, and esoteric traditions that echo across centuries. Symbols carved into cathedrals, manuscripts hidden in libraries, and moral philosophies transmitted through secretive channels are testament to the enduring presence of the Templars' influence. They reveal a continuity of purpose, a steadfast commitment to preserving knowledge, and the extraordinary capacity of human courage and discipline to endure even in the face of overwhelming persecution. These remnants of the Templars' survival continue to fascinate historians, scholars, and seekers of hidden knowledge, offering glimpses of a legacy that transcends conventional understanding of power, faith, and human responsibility. In the end, the surviving Templars and their influence remind us that history is rarely linear, and that the most profound legacies are often preserved not through visibility and acclaim, but through discipline, secrecy, and moral courage. The knights who survived the Purge, who carried manuscripts and relics across distant lands, and who inspired secret networks were the living embodiment of a covenant that stretched back to Solomon's temple. Their impact is a testament to the resilience of human purpose, the careful preservation of knowledge, and the extraordinary lengths to which disciplined, devoted individuals will go to safeguard a legacy far greater than themselves. The influence of the Templars did not end with their public demise. Instead, it morphed into a quieter, more elusive presence, one that would echo through the legends, myths, and secret societies that emerged in the centuries that followed. Even as kings and popes sought to erase their name and seize their wealth, the moral discipline, coded knowledge, and hidden treasures preserved by surviving knights became the seeds of new currents in European thought and mysticism. These currents were subtle, often invisible to the casual observer, but they carried the fingerprints of an order whose mission had always extended beyond the battlefield. The Templars had not merely been soldiers or administrators. They were custodians of a covenant of knowledge and wisdom, and their legacy would shape the imagination, spiritual inquiry, and secret traditions of generations to come. As rumors of surviving knights spread, so too did speculation about the treasures and knowledge they had protected. Tales emerged of hidden libraries, lost manuscripts, and relics whose significance went far beyond material value. Some whispered that the knights had preserved secrets that could illuminate hidden truths about the nature of faith, the divine, and the universe itself. Others spoke of cryptic symbols carved into architecture, scattered across Europe, serving as markers, guides, or lessons for those who could decipher them. These legends blurred the line between fact and imagination, creating a cultural memory in which the Templars became not only historical figures but symbols of hidden wisdom and enduring moral discipline. It was within this fertile ground of rumor and legend that secret societies began to emerge, inspired by the perceived ideals of the Templars. Freemasonry, Rosicrucian movements, and other esoteric orders of the Renaissance and early modern period adopted principles that mirrored those cultivated by the Knights. Discipline, moral integrity, secrecy, and the careful transmission of knowledge. Rituals emphasizing symbolic understanding, allegorical teaching, and ethical development echo the practices that had defined the Templars' inner life. While historical links are often difficult to prove definitively, the parallels are striking. The surviving knights had left a template, a moral, intellectual, and ritualistic framework that could endure even without the institutional structure of the order. Legends of Templar influence often focus on relics and manuscripts, but their impact extended far beyond physical objects. Surviving knights acted as mentors, advisors, and hidden guides, transmitting principles of strategic thinking, moral judgment, and ethical stewardship to individuals and communities capable of understanding and carrying forward their mission. This was a deliberate and disciplined form of influence, one that relied on discernment, secrecy, and fidelity to principle. Knowledge was never transmitted indiscriminately. It was shared carefully, tested against the moral character and intellectual capacity of the recipient. In this way, the Templars' influence persisted as a moral and philosophical force, guiding the development of thought and secret traditions across Europe. The myths surrounding the Templars' hidden treasures and knowledge also played a role in shaping European imagination. Stories of the Holy Grail, sacred relics, and esoteric wisdom became entwined with the memory of the knights, suggesting a continuity between the historical order and enduring mysteries. These tales, while fantastical in some respects, reflect a deeper truth, that the Templars' mission had always been as much about safeguarding invisible power as wielding visible influence. Their survival, encoded in symbols, rituals, and stories, allowed their legacy to persist even in the absence of a formal organization. The narratives that grew around them were a testament to the enduring allure of hidden knowledge and the moral and intellectual rigor required to preserve it. This interplay between legend and reality created a feedback loop in which the memory of the Templars influenced cultural, religious, and intellectual currents. Artists, writers, and scholars drew upon their story, weaving elements of discipline, secrecy, and moral responsibility into narratives that captivated the imagination. The Templars became symbols of courage, fidelity, and the pursuit of higher truths, their trials and perseverance serving as allegories for the human struggle to preserve wisdom in the face of corruption, envy, and persecution. Even when separated from their historical context, the values associated with the order continued to shape thought, inspiring subsequent generations to explore the hidden dimensions of morality, spirituality, and intellectual inquiry. The survival of Templar influence also demonstrates the subtlety of knowledge transmission. Coded manuscripts, symbolic architecture, and allegorical rituals allowed principles to be preserved without exposing the order to further danger. The discipline cultivated by the knights ensured that information was shared incrementally, through careful mentorship and observation, allowing wisdom to endure without compromising security. This methodology influenced later secret societies, establishing a tradition in which moral and intellectual training were inseparable from secrecy and ethical responsibility. The Templars' careful preservation of knowledge provided a model for how to transmit power, insight, and principle across generations in conditions of risk and uncertainty. The moral dimension of these networks cannot be overstated. Knights who survived and influenced subsequent movements were not merely preserving material wealth, they were safeguarding a moral covenant. Every manuscript, every symbol, and every ritual was part of a system designed to cultivate judgment, character, and ethical discernment. Knowledge, they understood, could be dangerous in the wrong hands. It required both intellect and moral fortitude, a lesson learned through centuries of guardianship and reinforced during the ordeals of persecution and imprisonment. The legacy of the Templars, therefore, is as much about moral education and ethical responsibility as it is about secrecy, strategy, or mystical wisdom. Some legends suggest that Templar influence extended into political and cultural spheres. Advisors, scholars, and influential figures who had interacted with surviving knights carried fragments of their principles into governance, education, and institutional organization. These indirect transmissions, often subtle and unrecorded, shaped the ways in which European societies approached knowledge, morality, and power. While difficult to trace concretely, these echoes reflect the enduring impact of an order whose mission had always transcended the immediate concerns of battle or finance. The Templars had been trained to think in terms of legacy, continuity, and the careful stewardship of knowledge, a perspective that allowed their influence to extend far beyond their temporal existence. The blending of historical fact with legend also created an aura of mystery that has endured into the modern era. Tales of hidden treasure, sacred relics, and secret societies fueled the imagination of writers, artists, and scholars, creating a cultural fascination that persists to this day. Yet beneath the layers of myth lies a truth grounded in discipline, moral rigor, and strategic foresight. The Knights' influence was not only in what was preserved but in how it was preserved, through secrecy, encoded transmission, and careful mentorship. Their methods ensured that the principles of the order could survive even when the formal organization had been destroyed. Ultimately, the Templars' post-dissolution influence is a testament to the power of moral, intellectual, and spiritual discipline. Even in the absence of public recognition, they shaped the course of European thought, mysticism, and secret traditions. Their legacy demonstrates that the preservation of knowledge, the cultivation of virtue, and the exercise of discretion can extend far beyond immediate circumstances. The order's survival in legend, ritual, and secret networks underscores the profound impact that a disciplined and principled institution can have, echoing through time long after its visible structures have vanished. The Templars, in this sense, became more than knights. They became symbols of continuity, guardianship, and moral responsibility. Their story illustrates that influence is not measured solely by visibility or power, but by the careful stewardship of wisdom and principle. Through secret networks, encoded manuscripts, and enduring rituals, they ensured that the covenant they had inherited from Solomon's guardians would persist, shaping the imagination, ethics, and spiritual inquiry of generations long after their formal demise. Their legacy is a reminder that the most enduring power is often hidden, preserved in discipline, secrecy, and the unwavering commitment to something larger than oneself. The relics of the Templars have long been shrouded in mystery, objects whose value transcended mere material wealth, and whose significance reached into the realms of legend, spirituality, and hidden knowledge. Across Europe, tales emerged of sacred vessels, ceremonial swords, and cryptic manuscripts that had survived the persecution of the order, carefully hidden by knights who understood their true importance. These relics were not simply treasures to be displayed or sold. They were instruments of continuity, vessels of wisdom, and symbols of an ancient covenant that stretched back to Solomon's temple. The aura surrounding them was electric, a combination of fear, reverence, and awe, suggesting that within these objects lay insights into human nature, divine order, and the hidden workings of the world itself. Some relics were physical embodiments of faith and ritual, tangible symbols of the Templars' sacred mission. Chalices, censers, and ceremonial swords carried not only aesthetic and material value but encoded knowledge, moral principles, and spiritual authority. Each object had been consecrated, imbued with ritual significance, and carefully preserved. The knights understood that their role as custodians required them to treat these relics with extraordinary care, ensuring that they were never exposed to those unprepared to understand their purpose. To mishandle or misinterpret such objects could lead not only to physical loss but to moral and spiritual compromise, a principle that had guided the guardians of Solomon's temple for generations. Manuscripts were among the most potent and enigmatic of Templar relics. These were not ordinary historical records but carefully coded documents containing layers of meaning. Some described ritual practice, ethical frameworks, or philosophical insight. Others contained cryptic diagrams, symbolic language, or esoteric knowledge that could not be accessed without training, moral discipline, and initiation into the order's hidden methods. The manuscripts were transmitted with meticulous care, hidden in monasteries, estates, and secret chambers, encoded so that even the most inquisitive outsider could not easily uncover their meaning. They were intellectual and spiritual instruments, tools to cultivate wisdom and preserve continuity across generations. Legends of miraculous properties and supernatural influence grew around these relics. Tales circulated that certain ceremonial objects could heal, protect, or illuminate truths hidden from ordinary perception. Some whispered that swords blessed and consecrated by the Templars could strike with divine precision, while chalices or vessels held knowledge capable of revealing moral or spiritual insight. The potency of these objects, whether literal or symbolic, reinforced the idea that the Templars were not merely custodians of wealth or territory, but of a sacred, almost cosmic responsibility. Their guardianship was both practical and spiritual, linking the knights to an ancient covenant that imbued their mission with extraordinary gravity. The distribution and concealment of these relics were as deliberate as their creation. Surviving knights understood that the preservation of knowledge and sacred objects required both secrecy and strategy. Some relics were hidden in remote abbeys or fortified castles, Others were dispersed across regions to ensure redundancy, safeguarding against total loss. Manuscripts and symbolic objects were encoded or disguised, their true significance accessible only to those who had been trained in the order's disciplines. This meticulous approach reflects the extraordinary foresight and intelligence of the Templars, who understood that the survival of the Covenant depended not only on physical protection, but on moral and intellectual stewardship. These relics also played a crucial role in the creation and perpetuation of Templar legend. Stories of hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and miraculous artifacts spread throughout Europe, often amplified by fear, fascination, and the natural human desire to understand the extraordinary. Some tales claimed that knights could summon divine protection, interpret hidden truths, or unlock ancient wisdom through contact with these objects. Others suggested that the relics held keys to understanding the cosmos, spiritual hierarchy, or moral order. Whether fact, embellishment, or deliberate misdirection, these narratives contributed to the mystique of the Templars and ensured that even in their suppression, the order's influence persisted. The psychological impact of these relics on those who encountered them was profound. Knights, scholars, and even rulers who gained access to Templar objects often reported a sense of awe, reverence, or moral accountability. The relics were designed not only to safeguard knowledge but to cultivate insight, reflection, and discipline. Their power was as much symbolic as it was functional, reinforcing the values of courage, fidelity, and moral integrity that had defined the order for centuries. In this sense, the relics were living instruments, shaping behavior, guiding thought, and preserving the ethical framework of a covenant older than kingdoms. Some relics have been the subject of enduring historical speculation. The Holy Grail, often associated with Templar legends, is believed by some scholars to be a symbolic representation of the order's deeper mission rather than a literal object. Manuscripts allegedly detailing the Grail's properties are coded, suggesting that the true purpose was to preserve a moral and intellectual tradition rather than to serve as a material prize. Similarly, ceremonial swords and sacred vessels, frequently mentioned in folklore, are understood not only as tools of ritual, but as repositories of symbolic wisdom, teaching, and continuity. The Templars' careful encoding and preservation practices ensured that these relics would survive centuries of persecution, mythologizing, and cultural transformation. The influence of these relics extended beyond the knights themselves. Individuals and communities who encountered Templar objects often found their perspectives shaped by their presence, whether consciously or unconsciously.